To our today's event, which is the research workshop Pius XII and East Central Europe in the nascent Cold War. First, one technical remark, which I'm going to read because the whole workshop is going to be recorded. It's not streamed, but recorded, and then you can see it. It will be published on our internet site of Nations Memory Institute. So first, one technical remark, because of GDPR, as Nations Memory Institute would like to ensure compliance with General Data Protection Regulation, known as GDPR, we would like to inform you that the discussion will be recorded by audio-visual means. Full details of the processing of personal data can be found outside the entrance to the hall. So if you have any question, you can contact the responsible organization team. The research workshop, Pius XII and East Central Europe in the nascent Cold War, is organized by Nations Memory Institute in cooperation with the Faculty of Roman Catholic Theology of Cyril and Methodius of Comenius University, Bratislava, with support of the grant agency of the Ministry of Education, Science, Research and Sport of the Slovak Republic. Now I would like to ask the chairman of the advisory board of Nations Memory Institute, Dr. Jan Pálffy, to take the word with an opening speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you to this workshop on the issue of the Holy See's policy towards the states of Central Eastern Europe after the World War II. This was a crucial period during which, on the one hand, people enjoyed the end of the most horrific conflict in the world history. On the other hand, as a result of the Yalta agreements and the Soviet Union's rise to power, communist regimes began to establish themselves in the various countries in Central and Eastern Europe. After their establishment, regimes with the totalitarian character launched persecutions against real and alleged opponents. The Church and believers faced the harshest persecutions. Communists viewed them as enemies, considering religion belief in the spirit of Karl Marx's thesis to be the opium of mankind. The regime started the fight against the Church by the sharpest means: the imprisonment of bishops and the higher church hierarchy, the liquidation of religious orders, the submission of the Church by a series of so-called church laws, and systematic social discrimination against the believers involved. However, all citizens suffered. I need to mention also the deportations to the Soviet gulags, the displacement of national minorities, open political persecutions, show trials, forced collectivization. This long line of injustices and crimes by the communist regime could go on. We have information about people's suffering during communism from their testimonies and the archives in the former communist states, which were made available for research after the fall of the communist regime. Today, however, we can also supplement our knowledge with the materials from archives in the West. When the archives of the Pontificate of Pope Pius XII were opened on the 2nd of March 2020, not only historians, but also the wider public welcomed the fact as a historical event. The archives cover the long period from 1939 to 1958, when major events took place, such as the World War II with all its horrors, the division of Europe into two ideological blocs, the beginning of the Cold War, the establishment of totalitarian communist regimes and the related persecutions of churches and believers. The Pontificate of Pius XII also applies to an extremely difficult period Slovakia had to go through since the end of the World War. More than 2 years have passed since the opening of the archives, and the researchers involved had the opportunity to gain their first more well-founded knowledge based on archival research. Even though the historical research of the Pontificate of Pope Pius XII has so far focused more on the war period, the post-war years are also interesting. It is also worth mentioning the absence of further research on the relationship of Pope to the part of Europe behind the Iron Curtain, for example, Czechoslovakia, Poland, or Hungary. I believe that the research workshop Pius XII and East Central Europe in the context of the Cold War, organized by the Nations Memory Institute in cooperation with the Faculty of Roman Catholic Theology of Cyril and Methodius of Comenius University, Bratislava, will contribute to a better knowledge of this important issue. I wish you all a successful and fruitful workshop. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for the opening speech. Now we can regard our workshop as opened. I forgot to mention one important issue. All the research workshop is being held in English, and it is not going to be translated because, as you see, we have international guests from Latvia, from Hungary, from Poland, and there was no other possibility to communicate with each other. So I believe that this way will be suitable for all of us. Now, let us continue with an introduction case speech of Professor Emília Hrabovec from Comenius University. She's also a member of Pontifical Committee of the Holy See for Historical Sciences. She will make some introductory remarks, so please take the word.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, dear friends, in March 2020, the Vatican has opened its archives for the Pontificate of Pius XII, as we have already heard. This was doubtlessly one of the most important pontificates in the history, and above all in contemporary history. Pius XII had to govern the Church of Rome in turbulent times, filled with dramatic events such as the Second World War and the Shoah, the Cold War with its division of the world into two political and ideological blocs, its proxy wars, psychological warfare, that not really tried to instrumentalize even religion. The post-war reconstruction that produced an unprecedented material prosperity in the West, or with large-scale movements like the decolonization or the ideological and economic exports of every sort that set a course for a new global world. Against the background of these developments, the Catholic Church experienced a dynamic universalization and intensification of her world presence, the internationalization of the Roman Curia, as well as the re-emergence of the papacy as an influential global force, but also cruel persecutions and martyrdom under totalitarian regimes, an accelerated secularization of the world with deep repercussions on the firmness of the Catholic faith, and the Catholic way of life, growing theological searches and confusions, think about the Nouvelle Theologie, and the gradual decline of what had once been the European Christian civilization. Already this brief characteristic demonstrates the importance of the pontificate for the Catholic Church, her identity, as well as her positioning within the world, and makes it obvious why generations of historians, not to speak of journalists of every sort, felt attracted by this pontificate, producing an almost endless list of publications. Under the surface of this pure quantity, there remains, however, a visible thematic, chronological, and geographical imbalance in the research. For decades, the most intensive research and the most vivid historiographical debate, stimulated by the ideological battles of the neo-Marxist revolution of the 60s, and facilitated by the famous publication of the 11 volumes of the documents of the Holy See, Actes Documents du Saint-Siège, were focused on the first part of the pontificate. It asked on the question how the Pope managed the world military conflict and the tragedies that accompanied it, first of all, Shoah. The wide range of topics particularly virulent in the second and far longer part of the pontificate, among them such crucial questions as how the Holy See and the Pontiff met the challenges of communism and the nascent World War and the nascent Cold War, remained somehow in the shadows and reduced even in specialized monographs to short final remarks. Geographically, the Pacellian historiography concentrated primarily on Western Europe and the Atlantic world, while the eastern part of the old continent, with some exceptions for the Soviet Union, remained for long and in a sense continues to remain on the edge of the interest of the international scientific community. Significantly, when in June 2021, the German Historical Institute in Rome and the École Française de Rome organized the first large research meeting dedicated to the Pacellian pontificate after the opening of the new archival documents, a 3-day conference entitled War and Genocide, Reconstruction and Change, the Global Pontificate of Pius XII, it was doubtlessly a highly interesting and scientifically valid conference, but both thematically and personally completely focused on the Western world and its derivatives, like the processes of decolonization. My paper happened to be the only contribution from a country and on a topic regarding the world east of Germany. The mutual isolation of Western and Eastern historiographies, to use an expression of András Fejérdy, whom we have the honor to have among us, has several reasons. Linguistic barriers, the natural inclination of the leading Western historiography to focus on their own issues, a certain cultural and etatist forma mentis of the international research, less inclined to examine the history of regions with weak or absent traditions of independent statehood, and the fact that Eastern European historiography herself could not raise her voice freely before 1989 and struggled hard to integrate into the international scientific debate on the papacy after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Different methodological approaches and sources play a role too. The concentration on the big players on the political chessboard and the global international relationships examined primarily on the basis of foreign policy documents, but lacking a more nuanced and circumspect interpretation of the Vatican's relation with singular states, above all in the eastern part of the continent on one side, and the tendency to concentrate on bilateral relations between the single Eastern European states and the Holy See, and draw from the national, political, and party archives, but mostly lacking broader international and comparative viewpoints on the other side. Unlike the traditionally Western-dominated Holy See history, the international historians of the Cold War could never ignore the crucial East European space, but only rarely recognized the importance of the Holy See as an actor in the global conflict. with the consequence that the Cold War research and the Pius XII research, at least regarding Eastern Europe, tended to work and to march past each other without any points of contact. Significantly, the prominent Cambridge history of the Cold War, that counts thousands of pages in several volumes, does not contain even one single article on the Holy See, not even in the index. Another specific feature that accompanies the historiographical reflection on Pius XII since the early 60s is the fact that in the course of the post-war development, it became gradually intertwined with the public, political, and ecclesiastical discourse that contaminated it with political and ideological disinterpretations and instrumentalizations, and theological polemics as well. Let us mention the controversy over the alleged silence of the Pope during the war, the polemics on the attitudes of the Pope regarding the international politics, communism, and the Atlantic Alliance, confrontations between different theological visions, between the conservative and the progressive, the conciliar and the anti-conciliar Catholicism, different opinions regarding the canonization of the popes, etc. The increasingly secularized historical science was still less and less able to recognize the real nature of the Catholic Church and the spiritual dimension of the supreme authority, and instead of analyzing the pontificate sine ira et studio in all the necessary details and nuances, it used it rather as a battlefield to confirm the own a prioristic political thesis. The long inaccessibility of the Vatican or other ecclesiastical sources did the rest, obliging the historians to rely almost exclusively on state diplomatic papers and to reconstruct the activities of the Holy See and her diplomacy primarily, if not exclusively, in terms of political history. The result was a politicization of the discourse on Pius XII that influenced a series of historical interpretations. With regard to the post-war period, the probably most impacted notion was the anti-communism of the Pope, undoubtedly one of the most mentioned aspects of the Pope's post-war policy. Many historians saw his anti-communism, at least compared with the policy of dialogue initiated by his successors, as fanatically intransigent, or, I quote, assessing the facts in ideological rather than political terms, end of the quotation, unable to take pragmatic advantage of possible political opportunities, to differentiate between actors and partners within the communist camp, and thus co-responsible for the outbreak and the radicalization of the Cold War. In other words, Pius XII anti-communism was interpreted in the same light as the anti-communism of a Harry Truman or an Ike Eisenhower, or as the communist rulers had interpreted it at the peak of the Cold War. It is as a political doctrine of a political actor in a political conflict, not as what it really was, a primarily theological vision of a church leader in what he perceived as a primarily spiritual, eschatological struggle between Christianity and communism, gospel and anti-gospel. More than 2 years have passed since the opening of the Vatican archives, but a comprehensive scientific balance would still be hopelessly premature. Firstly, because of the enormous quantity of the archival material that would require years to be read and evaluated. And secondly, because of the unexpected complications caused by the COVID pandemic that led to repeated closures of the archives, to a strict contingentation of working places and the necessity of a long advance reservation, and in January 2022, to the decision that only vaccinated and recovered researchers are authorized to enter the Vatican. Nonetheless, the first results lay on the table, and if anything else, they enable us to evaluate more accurately the status questionis and formulate new research questions in order to overcome the accumulated imbalances and instrumentalizations, liberate the research from a prioristic judgments, examine the decision-making processes and the dynamics behind the scenes in a more detailed way, and to discuss in a more nuanced and at the same time more comprehensive way new methodological approaches and questions. Let me formulate some of them. Which problems did the Holy See saw as crucial for the Church behind the Iron Curtain? What strategies did she develop in order to secure the survival of the Church? What information did the Holy See really had at her disposal, and by which channels of communication did she obtain them? How differentiated was the treatment of the individual states and nations behind the Iron Curtain? Was there a difference in the treatment of, let's say, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and others? What differences were there in the decision-making processes within the Roman Curia? What part did the dynamics of the Cold War and the relationships between the great powers play in these processes? This is precisely the main scope of the research workshop, quantitatively small, but hosting prominent experts' experience in the Vatican research from five countries. Not to offer definitive answers, but to discuss research questions, compare first results, and define further research approaches. The focus on East Central Europe is not only filling a white spot in the research of a region little known to the rest of the world, but is of significant relevance for the understanding of the entire pontificate. If somewhere, then in the post-war East Central Europe, answers can be found to fundamental questions. Was Pius XII a blind intransigent, and did he refuse any diplomatic means, as he is usually blamed for? The newest research demonstrates, on the contrary, that precisely with regard to the states behind the Iron Curtain, Pius XII was everything else than irrational and fanatical, but always sought diplomatic contacts and opportunities to help the Church behind the Iron Curtain. And under the condition that it would be serious and truly serve the Church, he was even ready to come to agreements with the states. The newest research shows, too, that the Pope and his diplomats were well aware of the existence of, be it only modest, differences between single communist politicians, and tried to make use of them to alleviate the situation of the Church. The Vatican chargé d'affaires in Prague, Gennaro Verolino, for example, repeatedly wrote to Rome that the Czechoslovak foreign minister Vlado Klementis was a far more cultivated man with a far broader political horizon than primitive ideological propagandists like Václav Kopecký or Alexei Čepička, and that he was trying to intervene through him in favor of the Church, but that he was well aware of the fact that the position of Klementis in the party and in the political system was becoming more and more fragile. The research of East Central European realities confirms, however, that the pragmatism of papal diplomacy could never be arbitrary, led by worldly political interest, but that it was the Catholic doctrine to determine its possibilities and limits, both with regard to the East and to the West. As long as there was a hope for an operative and effective modus vivendi, the papal diplomacy tried to come to terms with Czechoslovakia, Hungary, or Poland, also at the price of some compromises. But the communist regimes, however, launched an open anti-Catholic offensive with harsh persecutions, and moved even to set up a schismatic Catholic Church in the service of the regime, and the danger emerged that the clergy and the faithful could become disoriented and lose the moral resistance towards communism. The diplomatic pragmatism was substituted by a principled resistance. A resistance that, although having also political dimensions, was primarily of spiritual nature, or, as Pius XII in his eschatological vision of history saw it, had to face an apocalyptic struggle against an evil that was directed both against the divine and the natural law, and required primarily spiritual weapons. an intensification of the religious life and of spiritual solidarity on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The Catholic doctrine determined the possibilities and the limits of the papal diplomacy towards the West, too. In spite of a certain convergence of interests with the West that resulted from the common anti-communism and the logic of the Cold War, the pontiff never considered himself a soldier of a Western anti-Soviet crusade, for which cause President Truman tried to win him over. He suffered due to communist accusations of being liaised with the Anglo-Saxons and of propagating an alliance between Christ and dollar, and calling for a war, and even in the most radical period of the Cold War, did not hesitate to distance himself from both blocs, being convinced that neither had realized the Christian order as he considered it, the necessary condition for a just and lasting peace. On Christmas Eve of 1947, the Pope put it clearly, I quote, "Our opposition between the two opposing factions is not due to any prejudice or any preference for any nation or another, or for one group of nations or another, or nor is it influenced by the turn of events. Be with Christ or against Christ, this is the sole question. Be with Christ or against Christ, this is the sole question." In this sense, I wish us all a fruitful scientific seminar and many scientific results. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have seen that there are many issues which could be discussed in connection with the pontificate of Pius XII and in Central Europe, the challenges of communism, and the pontificate. This is maybe the main topic which will stay in the center of our attention, I believe, during the whole research workshop. Let us continue with the second presentation of the first panel, and I would like to ask Professor András Fejérdy to come to Speaker's Corner and to start his presentation about the communication channels between the Holy See and the Catholic Church in Hungary. Professor Fejérdy is Deputy Director of the Institute of History at the Research Center for the Humanities in Budapest and also Associate Professor of Church History at Péter Pázmány University, Catholic University in Budapest, and among his research fields are history of the Catholic Church in Central and Eastern Europe, and also the relationship between the Holy See and Hungary. So please.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, thank you for the invitation, and I start directly. How is the mail sent to Hungary? Asked Pius XII to his staff members in May 1950, when the possibility arose that information containing confidential correspondence between the Holy See and the Hungarian ordinaries had been leaked to Hungarian state security after the revocation of the appointment of Károly Gombos as auxiliary bishop of Kalosha. The Pope's question draws attention to how crucial it proved to be in post-1945 Holy See-Hungarian relations that the de facto abolition of the Budapest nunciature had ended the primary channel of official and confidential communication between the two parties. The evolution of relations between the Hungarian state and the Holy See after World War II and the attempts to restore the Budapest nunciature have been dealt with in considerable depth in the secondary literature. Until now, however, little attention has been paid to the channels of communication within the Church. In fact, as a consequence of the Holy See's pastoral diplomacy, nuncios not only represent the Pope before the secular authorities, but an important part of their mission is to represent the Holy Father to the local church. As the Pope's delegate to the local church, the nuncio's role is to monitor the internal life of the church, to guard Catholic doctrine and discipline, to communicate the decisions of the Pope and the dicasteries of the Holy See to the local church, and to grant dispensations and other ecclesiastical concessions by virtue of his delegated authority. But what if the Holy See is unable to communicate with the local church through a nuncio or other official delegate with a diplomatic status? In the following, we seek to answer this question by drawing on documents from the archives of the Holy See, which have now become accessible. In our overview, we do not attempt to provide a complex account of bilateral relations between the Holy See and the local church, but rather to focus on the channels of communication that Rome tried to establish in order to communicate the decisions taken by the Holy See to those concerned. We are therefore only tangentially concerned with the way in which reports on the situation of the Hungarian Church reached Rome, nor do we examine the channels through which the financial aid granted to the Hungarian Church by the Holy See or through the Holy See was delivered. We argue that in terms of communication channels, the Iron Curtain had already come down in 1945. In the first period, the damage to the infrastructure caused by the war, the occupied state of the country, and the diplomatic caution of the Western powers all contributed to the difficulties caused by the absence of a nunciature. But from the end of 1946 onwards, stable channels of communication were established alongside occasional channels. These were later curtailed not so much by the general escalation of the Cold War, but by the fact that in connection with the Mindszenty trial, the Hungarian authorities became aware that one of the most important channels of communication was the Swiss embassy. In 1945, the trial of the Hungarian primate thus resulted not only in a general freeze in Holy See-Hungarian relations, but also a turning point in internal church communication. In any case, an internal investigation conducted by the Holy See in 1950 to check the reliability of the channels used to transmit confidential information concluded that the Italian embassy in Budapest was still a safe channel for the transmission of the most important information to the Hungarian Church. Direct and formal diplomatic relations between the Holy See and Hungary, established in 1920, were suspended from 1945. In order to act more effectively in defense of the persecuted Jews, the Budapest nuncio, Angelo Rotta, like other diplomats from the other neutral countries, remained in Budapest after the failed Hungarian exit attempt from the war, thus de facto recognizing the pro-Nazi Szálasi government. This served as a pretext for the expulsion of the Pope's representative from the country by the Allied Control Commission on 4th April 1945. Next slide, please. Despite the fact that the war front had left the country, communication with the Holy See, which was already difficult, did not improve even after the armed hostilities had ended. The first opportunity to send documents from the Holy See to Hungary was not until the summer of that year. In mid-July 1945, the Jesuit father Alexander Töhötöm Nagy arrived in Rome. On his way back, he could smuggle home a document of great importance, the appointment of the new primate. At the same time, in the second half of the summer of 1945, another channel of communication, albeit less suitable for the transmission of highly confidential information, was established. Captain William Francis Dietrich, a member of the Allied Control Commission in Hungary, delegated by the US Navy, brought with him a letter from János Drahos, the Vicar General of Esztergom, and enclosed with it some further documents to Rome. A note by Domenico Tardini, the Secretary of the Congregation for Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs, on the matter shows that in the following months Dietrich was not only used as a liaison for the archdiocese of Esztergom, but that the Holy See also used his services. In any case, the reply to the arrival of the Drahos dispatches was also sent to the Vicar General via the Americans. In absence of a nunciature, and because even postal traffic was lacking in the autumn of 1945, one obvious solution seemed to be for the Holy See to call on the good offices of the two Western Allied powers to deliver confidential correspondence. In the months following the war, occupied Hungary, with only a provisional government, had no functioning embassies or channels of communication. These were available only to the victorious powers, so Rome repeatedly attempted to use American or British diplomacy to get important documents to the Hungarian Church. Also, the British had undertaken from June 1945 to be the primary liaison between the Holy See and Hungary. This appeared to apply only to relations with the secular authorities. British were primarily concerned to assist in promoting the re-establishment of Holy See-Hungarian relations, and in internal church communications, they undertook to transmit brief messages at most, not confidential documents. Next slide, please. Nor did the head of the American mission in Budapest, Arthur Schoenfield, take it for granted that he would deliver to Mindszenty the letter of substitute Giovanni Battista Montini, in which the letter informed the new Archbishop of Esztergom of his appointment as a cardinal. When, in October 1946, the Holy See sought ways to get more documents to Mindszenty, which had been undelivered for nearly 6 months, Joseph McGonough, an American staff member of the Vatican Secretariat of State, replied that the US ambassador in Budapest was willing to forward the mail only if it arrived in a fully open envelope. It seems that the Americans have followed this practice from the very beginning, which has since become standard practice. The fact that the Latin language letters sent to the Vatican in the summer of 1945 by János Drahos via naval captain Dietrich is accompanied by an English translation, and that the next letter of the Vicar General of Esztergom to Pius XII was written in English, suggests that the Americans were only willing to forward the mail if they could read its contents. While this was not a problem for the speeches and circulars of Cardinal Fejérdy sent from Esztergom to Rome in the summer of 1945, it was not acceptable for the Holy See when it wanted to send internal church measures and confidential documents from Rome to Hungary. During 1946, the Holy See could therefore continue to rely only on occasional communication channels. In December 1945 and between February-March 1946, Mindszenty's trips to Rome provided an exceptional opportunity to deliver important documents from the Holy See. In the following period, again the Jesuit father Töhötöm Nagy, who was constantly commuting illegally between the Eternal City and Hungary with American assistance, became one of the most important intermediaries. For instance, Father Nagy carried the document on the appointment of Bishop Kálmán Popov-Győr to Hungary in May 1946. In any case, the occasional channels between Rome and Budapest have proved insufficient. Mindszenty's English interpreter, István Kemenes, exaggerated perhaps a little bit, claiming in June 1946 that since his spring trip to Rome, and I cite, the Legatus Natus Sanctae Sedis in Hungary has been almost hermetically sealed off from the Holy See for 3 months now. But, as mentioned above, by October 1946, there was indeed a large package of letters accumulated since May, waiting at the Vatican to be delivered to Mindszenty. When it became clear that American diplomatic assistance could not be counted on, the Secretariat of State sought new avenues. First, they asked the nuncio of Prague if there was a way to forward mail to Budapest. However, Saverio Ritter informed his superiors that he did not have a secure link to the Hungarian capital either. There was also talk of using the Jesuit channel, but it turned out that the Hungarian provincial, István Borbély, who was in Rome to attend the general chapter of the order, had crossed the border illegally. For fear of being caught, it did not seem advisable to entrust him with letters from the Vatican Secretariat of State. The role of Töhötöm Nagy, who had until then been transmitting documents and information between Rome and Budapest with some regularity, could no longer be relied upon. The relationship between the Jesuit priests and Cardinal Mindszenty had deteriorated to the point of being irreparable, and his superiors decided that Father Nagy, who had returned to Rome in November 1946, should no longer go back to Hungary. The occasional channels of communication created a lot of uncertainty in the communication between the Holy See and the Hungarian Church. So Rome was constantly looking for a stable and reliable connection. A suitable solution was found in December 1946, when the Swiss government agreed to deliver Holy See documents to Mindszenty by its own diplomatic courier. Apparently, this channel worked perfectly until Mindszenty's arrest. But when in January 1949, in preparation for the cardinal's trial, the Hungarian authorities published the documents of Mindszenty crime case in the so-called Yellow Book, Swiss diplomacy suspended the delivery of the Holy See dispatches to Hungary and launched an investigation into the legitimacy of the good offices provided in bilateral communications. As reported in the January 1949 issue of La Tribune de Genève, the Yellow Book published details of confidential correspondence between Mindszenty and Gedeon Péterfi, rector of the Hungarian Pontifical Ecclesiastical Institute in Rome. This correspondence disclosed that the Holy See had sent mail to Mindszenty through the Swiss diplomatic courier with the consent of the Swiss government. In the wake of this news, and in order to prepare for possible attacks, Julien Rossa, head of administrative department of the Swiss Foreign Ministry, asked the nuncio of Bern for information on the legal basis for the use of Swiss courier by the Holy See to deliver letters addressed to the Hungarian cardinal. In his reply, Nuncio Filippo Bernardini referred to the diplomatic, quasi-apostolic delegate nature of Mindszenty's functions. Bernardini noted that the primate has received step-by-step special faculties from the Pope, which allow him to carry out the functions of an apostolic delegate almost in full. Since the apostolic delegates everywhere enjoy the highest diplomatic privileges, he argued, the Swiss government acted in a perfectly legitimate manner when it made its own diplomatic courier service available for correspondence between the primate and the Secretariat of State. Swiss Foreign Affairs head of department, Rossa, found the Holy See's arguments convincing enough, but indicated that the delivery of mail to Hungary would be temporarily suspended. However, this suspension soon turned into a permanent closure of the communication channel. Because of the difficulties experienced in the countries beyond the Iron Curtain, Switzerland decided in March that it would no longer deliver diplomatic courier mail to Poland, Bulgaria or Hungary, but only to the officially functioning nunciatures in the Soviet bloc. Also, the Swiss diplomatic channel functioned until January 1949 reliably. It had the disadvantage of being able to transmit messages only rather slowly. Documents were first sent from Rome to the nunciature in Bern, from where the Swiss diplomatic courier took them to the embassy in Budapest, where they were finally delivered to the addressee. This was not a problem in the normal course of business, but it did not allow to the delivery of urgent confidential messages. This inadequacy of existing communication channels became apparent in the case of Károly Gombos. In August 1948, Pope Pius XII appointed Gombos as auxiliary bishop of Archbishop József Grösz of Kalocsa. After the candidate accepted the appointment, it was first planned in Rome that the appointment would be published in the evening edition of L'Osservatore Romano on the 26th October. However, after Monsignor Giulio Barbetta, the Hungarian affairs officer, telephoned the consistorial congregation to indicate that the Secretary of State did not consider it advisable to use telegrams to send messages to Hungary, especially if the addressee was Mindszenty, the more cumbersome but more reliable channel of communication was chosen. This also necessitated a postponement of the publication of the appointment, which was thus scheduled for 10 November instead of the 26th of October. The forced postponement of the publication of the appointment due to poor communication opportunities turned out to be a stroke of luck. During November 1948, several denunciations against Károly Gombos were received from Hungary, questioning his suitability as a bishop because of his scandalous behavior and his well-known affairs with women. In the wake of the reports, the Pope ordered the postponement of the consecration of Gombos, scheduled for the 30th of November, and an investigation into the validity of the allegations. Due to the short time available, Tardini first telegraphed Mindszenty, and after the primate did not reply, he also did it to Archbishop József Grösz of Kalocsa to inform them of the suspension of the consecration. In his telegram of reply, sent a few days late, Mindszenty, observing the requirements of elementary caution, confirmed receipt of the message from the Holy See, as in the telegram from the Secretariat of State, only referring to the number of the case on the files. Archbishop Grösz, however, was not so prudent. He wrote openly in his cable that, I quote, "Also the appointment of the auxiliary bishop has become known in Hungary. He was waiting further instructions." The issue of Gombos' appointment was temporarily resolved by the suspension of the consecration, but the investigation requested by the Holy See was not being launched. Even if Mindszenty received a letter from the Secretariat of State which shed more light on the case of Gombos, the primate was no longer in a position to forward it to Grösz. In any case, after a few exchanges of correspondence, by January 1950, Grösz was able to reply to Rome that Károly Gombos has voluntarily resigned on 24 December 1949. It seemed that the matter, which had been dragging on since the autumn of 1948, had finally been resolved. But in his letter, Cardinal Grösz, Archbishop Grösz also reported to Rome that the Hungarian state security had contacted one of his priests, who, during his interrogations, came to the conclusion that the secret police knew everything that had been disposed by letter after the telegram of the Secretariat of State of the Holy See of 20th November 1948 to prevent the consecration of Gombos. This information prompted Pope Pius XII to ask the question already quoted in the introduction: how is the mail sent to Hungary? In its answer, the Secretariat of State made it clear that no mail was entrusted to the postal service. All documents were sent by diplomatic courier via the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in a sealed envelope to the Vicar General János Drahos at the Archbishop of Paris in Budapest, without the sender's name being indicated. Furthermore, the internal investigation established that in the case of Gombos, the only exceptions were the telegrams discussed above, sent to Primate Mindszenty and Archbishop Gross to stop the consecration as a matter of urgency. Thus, the Hungarian police could of course have been aware of these, and on the basis of the less than careful reply telegram from Archbishop Gross of Kalocsa, the police could have learned of the subject of the communication, that is, the suspension of Gombos' consecration. Nor could the investigation rule out the possibility that correspondence between Esztergom and Kalocsa concerning the unpleasant matter in question might have come into hands of the police. However, all other communications were sent by diplomatic courier mail. The investigation concluded thus that it was still possible to continue to send letters to the ordinaries in Hungary through the usual reliable channels, that is, through Italian embassy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. So we have now heard how very important were the secret communication channels in a situation when there were no direct relations between the Holy See and Hungary after Second World War, so already after the Second World War. So the last presentation of our morning panel will be from another Eastern European country, from Lithuania, better said about Lithuania, and I would like to ask Professor Arunas Streikus, who is head of Modern History Department at Vilnius University, to take the word. I just mentioned his research fields, the modern history, the history of the Church, and especially the relations between Lithuania and the Holy See. So please, the course is yours.
Yes. At first, I would like to say my thanks for the organizers of the conference for inviting me to share very first results of my research in Vatican archives. I have to mention that just 3 months ago I managed to arrange my first trip to Vatican archives after 2 unsuccessful attempts. So, of course, those findings in the archives during 2 weeks of my visit is very preliminary and very raw. The specifics of Baltic countries in context of Eastern Central Europe is that they very early already in the summer of 1940 became victims of Soviet expansion. So they were occupied and lost their independence and even formal agency. Nunciatures in Kaunas and in Riga ceased to function already in August of that year. So the Holy See since then has lost direct channel of communication and had to rely on information which reached it through various intermediaries. During the Second World War, that role was performed mainly by the nunciature in Berlin. But, however, this way was closed with occupation and following dismemberment of Germany, as well as with descending Iron Curtain on the lands reconquered by the Soviet Union. Under such circumstances, requiring reliable information on the conditions of ecclesiastical affairs and on the overall situation in the region became a big challenge for the Vatican. provision of instructions to bishops was also not an easy task at that time, because Baltic countries and Lithuania concretely hasn't any, even those possibilities which were in the Hungarian case. Recent opening of Vatican archives documents covering the years of Pius XII pontificate offers some insight into how the Holy See tried to cope with these issues during the first post-war decade. It must be noted that from the beginning that the bulk of documents reflecting activities of the Holy See in this field are conserved in the historical archive of the State Secretariat, not in the Vatican Apostolic Archive. In spite of the fact that Baltic countries constituted the part of the Soviet Union at that time, Congregation for Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs treated them as a unit separate from Russia, from Soviet Union, and archived all the papers on their matters in the special section Paesi Baltici. Only few materials on the topic one can find among papers of the Apostolic Delegation in Washington and nunciates in Paris and Bern, which acted sometimes as intermediaries between not Lithuania, but Lithuanian exiles and bodies and Rome. Together with the USA, the Vatican was unique to acknowledge the formal status for the diplomatic representation of former Lithuanian state, which continued to function in Rome and was included into the diplomatic corps published in Annuario Pontificium. Minister of Lithuania, Stasys Girdvainis, accredited by the Holy See in 1939, preserved his title until the death of Pius XII and was treated by the Vatican as full-fledged representative. He was regularly received by the substitutes of State Secretary, prelates Montini and Tardini, participated in special papal audiences for the diplomatic corps. However, Lithuanian diplomatic representation had more symbolic value. Due to the lack of ties with the occupied country, it wasn't able to act as an important source of information, and that also diminished its significance. At the end of the war, 3 out of 8 bishops of Lithuanian ecclesiastical province have left their dioceses, finding a temporary shelter in occupied Germany or Austria. From the very beginning, their relationship with the Holy See unfolded in a rather complicated way. The Pope and his assistants weren't very happy about Bishop's decision to leave country, to leave the flock behind, especially after they have realized that their excellencies lied to be forced to leave country by Germans, by retreating Germans. Exiled bishops, on their part, felt the grievance while being ignored by the Vatican in its efforts to procure pastoral services for Lithuanian war refugees in displaced persons camps, DP camps. Totally cut off from their home dioceses, exiled bishops weren't able to try any sort of distant management or to serve as possible providers of information either. perhaps as an expression of growing frustration, we must interpret plans of return conveyed in spring 1946 by one of them, auxiliary bishop of Kaunas Archdiocese Vincentas Brizgys. The secretary of the Third Vatican Mission in Germany, Monsignor Alberto Giovannetti, was asked by him to inquire in Rome if whether the Holy See has nothing against his eventual return to Lithuania. According to Giovannetti, I quote, he, Bishop Brizgys, is fully aware of difficulties and dangers, knows that he has to count with imprisonment, internment, or even deportation to Siberia, but he believes that either in the country or in deportation, he will be more useful than in Germany. The end of quote. A manual inscription on the document, made probably by Domenico Tardini, is laconic but very eloquent. Si loda, commendable. And it reflects the attitude of Vatican towards those bishops. The limited capabilities of the Holy See to monitor and to influence religious situation in countries under Soviet rule are probably best illustrated by the long-timed effort to deliver a secret letter with extraordinary arrangements regarding the governance of the church in Lithuania. 10 storyline, well documented in a separate archival dossier, started in autumn 1947 and broke up without any clear outcome just in the beginning of 1950. Anticipating a real opportunity that in the near future there will remain no acting bishop in Lithuania, the Vatican has resolved not only to grant temporary episcopal rights to all vicars who will be elected by diocese chapters, but also to nominate 3 clandestine bishops. And it was made. However, Secretariat of State still had to find a secure way to bring the message into Lithuania. After considering some other options in the early autumn 1948, it was decided to prepare the secret parcel addressed to Archbishop of Riga, Antonius Springovich. In order to reach the latter, the message was to follow a long chain of intermediaries, starting from the apostolic delegate in Washington, Amleto Cikoniani, through the Latvian charge d'affaires, Anatoly Dinbergs, and a Latvian priest living in Stockholm. And the last place is, of course, Riga and later even Kaunas. Simultaneously, the identical letter was sent to Cardinal August Grond in Warsaw. However, neither of both paths proved to be successful. Polish option stalled due to the death of Cardinal, while the Latvian channel stuck in Stockholm. The Bishop Cikoniani was compelled then to ask the apostolic vicar in Sweden, Bishop Ansgar Nelson, to take the parcel back and to look for other ways how to deliver it to Riga and later to Kaunas. So, after nearly 1 year from the issue of document, it still didn't arrive to the final destination. Another year has passed, but the situation hardly changed. In the beginning of 1950, the Congregation for Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs was informed by Cicconiani from Washington that Bishop Nelson gave a copy of the letter to one officer who has possibility to interact with Latvian fishing ships visiting ports of Sweden. Unfortunately, there is no more data in the archival dossier about the further trip of the ill-fated letter. And I would suggest that it did not reach Lithuania at all. It is noteworthy that the Vatican in autumn 1948 has refused to use another possible channel to reach Catholic Church in Lithuania. Lithuanian exiles have suggested to employ envoys of armed resistance who stayed at the time in Paris and in the next future had to be parachuted back into the country. From the correspondence of the congregation, which it had with the nunciature in Paris, we know that in the last minute, Domenico Tordini vetoed this proposal. Materials on the situation of religious life in Soviet Lithuania, brought by the same representative of Lithuanian resistance, were also treated in Rome with high caution, not to say suspicion. And those documents, the detailed appeal of Lithuanian Roman Catholics to the Pope, among them, have reached the Secretariat of the State just in September 1948. Prelate Luigi Poggi, who was then responsible for the affairs of Eastern Europe in Secretariat, prepared dutifully the summary of all received materials, but it seems the latter didn't attract much interest neither from Tordini nor from the Pope. The answer to the pontific delegate for Lithuanians in Germany, who has submitted above-mentioned materials, was rather formal. Instead of an eloquent moral support wished by suffering Lithuanian Catholics, they stated merely that the Holy Father has received with anguish news about the hard conditions which are imposed on his children. It was also promised that His Holiness will never stop striving for natural and fundamental rights of every nation. Likewise, addresses submitted by Lithuanian political bodies acting in exile were met with distance. So, for example, the letter of prominent Catholic leaders of Lithuanian exile, where they once again requested words of moral support, was answered with identical wording as in the above-mentioned case. There were more concerns in the Vatican about information signaling that some clergymen of occupied Lithuania could be involved in the Soviet propaganda campaign directed against the Pope and the Holy See. In the late autumn 1950, the Vatican eagerly collected messages from several sources in order to clear up circumstances surrounding the participation of Canon Juozapas Stankevičius, who at that time has administered 3 dioceses in Lithuania, about his attendance in the Congress of Pacifists organized in Moscow. The apostolic delegate in London, William Godfrey, who was the first to inform about the case, he has pointed to the fact that Canon Stankevičius wasn't forced to directly attack the Holy See and that he wasn't elected as a member of the Committee for Peace Defense, which included representatives of all other major religions in Soviet Union. Procurator for the Congregation of Marian Fathers, Lithuanian Juozas Vaišnora, who also pledged in his letter to know from reliable sources that Stankevičius was compelled to go to Moscow to the Congress and to give the speech there by force. That and the English translation of the Stankevičius speech in the Congress, delivered by the representative of United Kingdom to the Holy See, this time were enough to reassure the Vatican that it doesn't constitute a case of open retreat from Rome. Research of the archival files related to Lithuanian affairs suggests that main providers of information for Congregation for Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs in this field since the beginning of 50s were 3. Above mentioned Father Vaišnora from Marian Fathers in Rome, the rector of Pontifical Lithuanian College of St. Casimir, Laudas Tulaba, and the Lithuanian legation by the Holy See, which I have mentioned at the beginning. Lithuanian newsletter Elta Press, published in Rome, was also referred quite frequently. All of them had their own providers of news from occupied country, but 2 main categories of sources were common for them. That means correspondence, clandestine correspondence with priests working in Lithuania, or interviews with those who were permitted to repatriate from Soviet Lithuania to USA, United Kingdom, Germany, or other countries. As a closer look at individual cases reveals, the information received in that way and forwarded often to Vatican was very inaccurate or even clearly manipulative. For example, Father Vaišnora, in a note, The Fate of Lithuanian Bishops, mistakenly claimed that there are only 3 functioning churches in Kaunas and that believers have to pay for permission to participate at the Mass. Among materials delivered by Vaišnora, one can also find an interesting instance how the voice of KGB agent could reach the ears of the Pope. In January 1956, he has submitted a translation of the letter received from Lithuania from other Marian priest, who was and is known as an active collaborator of the Soviet secret services. The author of the letter accuses the Western propaganda for having fostered illusions of rapid liberation of Lithuania and armed resistance with a lot of victims. He also claims that Lithuanians couldn't wait anymore and had to adapt themselves to existing situation. So the West can't reproach them for that. On the note of congregation official who has prepared a summary of the letter, there is a manual remark made by probably Samore, Archbishop Samore, that it was referred to the Pope on January 24 of that year. The first occasion when Roman Lithuanians and the Vatican could enter into the direct contact with people living in Soviet Lithuania came just at the beginning of 1958. It couldn't be said the encounter was very cordial. That time, the special group of Lithuanian Catholic tourists, of course carefully selected in advance, emerged at the doors of the State Secretariat literally. According to a note, they came here to ask for a special audience of the Pope. The official who has accepted them explained that they ought to address Lithuanian College in Rome or any other ecclesiastical institution for a recommendation at first. The note on this event is concluded with the remark that it is important to bear in mind a clear interest of Soviet authorities for the group to be received by the Pope. So, in the case, I quote further, in the case Holy Father would deem it is appropriate to admit Lithuanians to a kiss of the hand, the following precautions are to observe. First of all, Rector of Lithuanian College will provide the names of individual Lithuanians after making sure that each of them is practicing Catholic. Secondly, the ticket would be issued with the name of each of the person to be admitted, and therefore with the exclusion of any interpreter. And thirdly, the mention in the Osservatore Romano will be omitted. So three precautions. In the end, group was allowed to take part only in a general audience. After press conference, which was arranged for members of the group a bit later, somebody, Samore or even Tardini, has left a brief but eloquent commentary on that history. I quote, "Have you seen the gaming of Lithuanian Catholics? It was truly fortunate that Santo Padre did not receive them. Weren't we a bit optimistic?" End of the quote. In conclusion, I have to say, and one has to admit, that during the first post-war decade, the Holy See had very limited capabilities to communicate with Catholics under Soviet rule, and in Lithuania concretely. Obviously, the primary goal was to secure functioning of loyal ecclesiastical structures, and in order to achieve that task, the Vatican preferred to rely on tested channels, maximally tested channels, rather than risk to enter unexplored path, as in the case of Lithuanian resistance delegates. At least in the Lithuanian case, we can also see a very precocious stance towards exile actors and representatives of anti-Soviet resistance, avoiding to voice a clear support of their cause. The latter think would question still prevailing image of Pius XII, which presents him and his entourage as ardent cold warriors. Another matter is that there were hardly any hopes during the pontificate about possibility to reach some sustainable agreement with communist governments regarding pastoral functions of the church, and especially, of course, in Soviet Union. during Stalin reign. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much. So we have seen how difficult the situation in Lithuania was, which was occupied even in 1940 for the first time through the Soviets. And according to this, the persecutions and so on started in 1940. Without losing time, I would like to start an open discussion. First, Professor Hrabovec would like to make some remarks, and then you have an opportunity to make questions.
Following the old experience that somebody still has to begin with a discussion. So since we are not a conference in the strict sense of the word, but we are a seminar, a workshop, this means an opportunity to discuss, to deepen in discussions. I would like to start with some remarks, not as answers, not as questions, but just as remarks in order to stimulate further discussion. I would like to underline two moments, two questions. The first question, the importance of the dynamics of the Cold War and the single stages of the Cold War for the relationships of the Holy See and the individual states. So the intercourse between the dynamics of the Cold War and the policy of the Holy See towards Eastern Europe. Particularly clear it is in the case of Yugoslavia. As long as Yugoslavia was a full communist member of the Soviet bloc, Washington, as a part of its Cold War policy, was ready to sustain the efforts of the Holy See in order to help the Church behind the Iron Curtain, by means, above all, of the American at the service of the Vatican diplomacy, Joseph Hurley, the diplomatic representative of the Holy See in Belgrade. But in the very same moment at which Yugoslavia broke with Moscow and tried to emancipate from Moscow, Washington changed its Cold War policy towards Belgrade and began to sustain the emancipation movement in Yugoslavia, also at the price of sacrificing the interests of the Church. So this is maybe the first remark, the first point to be further discussed. The second point, the importance of communication channels. We could make a comparison with the interwar period. One of the most important fears of the Holy See in the 20s and 30s was to lose every communication channel, every possibility to be in touch with the Catholic Church in Soviet Union. And the efforts to maintain these communication channels by means of good services of Western diplomats. Diplomatic luggage, first of all, the German one in the 20s, the French one in the 30s, the American one in the late 30s. So this might be the second important question to be put in the international scientific discourse, the communication channels. For us, in our Slovak case, it is particularly interesting because, as we shall see afternoon, the most important communication channel went not across the Internunciatura in Prague, but across the Archbishop of Vienna, Theodor Initza, and across Jesuit channels that connected Slovakia and the Church in Slovakia with Vienna and through Vienna with Rome. So this for my part.
Thank you very much. Now, Father Slepčan would like to ask, môžem poprosiť niekoho z kolegov, aby odniesli mikrofón? Ďakujem.
Ďakujem pekne, pozdravujem všetkých účastníkov a poprosím vás potom o preklad otázky. V roku 1945 Pius XII bol už pápežom 6 rokov. Má za sebou náročné obdobie a ešte asi ťažšie pred sebou. Moja otázka je, ak sa dá na všetkých 4 referujúcich, či sú paralely v jeho prístupe k týmto dvom obdobiam a či tieto porovnávania nám môžu pochopiť aj jedno i druhé obdobie lepšie. Inými slovami, či z prvého obdobia 39-45 nachádzame aplikovanie tých istých postupov aj po roku 1945. Dôraz na miestne cirkvi, informačné kanály, možno nie je príliš veľká verbálna explicitnosť pri menovaní nepriateľa, o to väčšia aktívna účasť cez asistenciu a tak ďalej. Ďakujem.
Well, the question is about the possible parallels, so about similarities and other approaches in the pontificate of the Pius XII in the period of the Second World War, so until 1945, and in the period after the Second World War. And these parallels should be asked as for the approaches toward local churches, information channels, and so on. And the question is for all panelists, so you can take the word.
So I start to reflect and answer the question for which I'm grateful. The first parallel which came in my mind was that of how to deal with a totalitarian regime and its dictator. Several times in 1946, 1947, but even in 1956, in documents of the Secretariat of State appears the name of Hitler and the experience of the Concordate with the Reich of 1933. We made this Concordate and there were no guarantees to maintain it, and Hitler did not maintain it. Should we enter in negotiations with this other totalitarian regime? What are the guarantees that the results of any negotiation would be maintained and satisfied? And that is the point, first of all, between Kremlin and the Vatican, but also with the local communist regimes, even if it seems to be some openness to negotiation with the Holy See. Is it a true, a sincere openness, or is there something behind it which wants to instrumentalize the Holy See and the Church? This is the first parallel. In terms of communication channels, at least for the Hungarian case, I don't see any parallels. For the Soviet Union again, or the territories occupied by the Soviet Union, there are similarities. I know a little bit the case of the Assumptionist father Leopold Braun, who was the last and the only Catholic priest in the Soviet Union, in Moscow itself, from the mid-30s until 45. It was end of 45, beginning of 46 that he had to leave Moscow, and how it was difficult to be in touch with him. His correspondence is known with his superiors in France and in the States, because he was an American-born Assumptionist priest. But I have seen documents which reveals that he tried to smuggle out information from Moscow via French channels, but the French diplomatic corps were not so kind, and they spread information which was confidential information communicated through them, and that's why some press news and rumors in the years 44, for example, can have a source from French diplomatic source, and in 45 Tardini notes we should communicate somehow to Braun not to use French channels. Another channel which was used from him, it was the Tehran apostolic delegate, because he succeeded in getting in touch with them through some way, but it was very, very, very difficult. I see some parallels in this. And to reflect shortly on what Professor Hrabovec said, I just want to complete it with the question of communication channels with two observations. The one is the Jesuit channel. Jesuit and other religious orders as possible channels which had a network in the East and in the West, and could get in touch in different ways. I think it is a very important, interesting path which should be analyzed in a more approfundated way. And the other one, which were the diplomatic posts of the Holy See, which had a major role in transmitting communication from the West to the East and vice versa. And I think Bern, the Nunciator of Bern, had an extremely important role. All press news from the East were translated there and communicated to Rome by Bern, and also Hungarian exile and not exile Catholic persons had contact firstly to Bern, which was neutral, and that's why perhaps more easily to accede. So Bern certainly, and of course the Catholic nunciators as Italy, French, Belgium, but also the apostolic delegation in Washington, Cicognani, had an important role, because he got many information from all over the world through American channels. And last but not least, I was very curious to hear the Stockholm channel, or the attempt to use Stockholm as a point of transmission into the East. And I have also information about negotiations between the Holy See and Soviet Union, or some authorities behind the Iron Curtain, already in 45, the autumn of 45, to achieve some modus vivendi, some agreement to facilitate the life of Catholics behind the future Iron Curtain. And Stockholm is mentioned by Padre Leiber, the secretary of Pius XII, to a Hungarian Jesuit expressly. We are in discussions with Moscow through Stockholm, but the results are not yet arrived. I have not found until now any document which confirms this information, but it seems that Stockholm, again a neutral country, had some some role in transmitting information.
Okay. At first, I would like to add my remark to already mentioned 4 points of interest for research of that period. I think one more very important question is about the role, about the impact of Soviet Union as a leading force in this bloc of communist countries already in the first post-war decade. How deep was Moscow's impact on the issues in Eastern Central Europe regarding those relationship with Vatican, and also the role played by the Orthodox churches in this region, because Russian Orthodox Church, revived by Stalin in 1943, has played a role in this gamble. And I wonder what was the role of other Orthodox churches in the region, especially in those where Orthodox Church was the main religious organization. And once again, what was the impact on them coming from Moscow Patriarchate, and those all. This issue we have to bear in mind when speaking about this period in Eastern and Central Europe. And if to answer the question, in fact, I have little to say maybe on Lithuanian issue, because I have still no touched documents of the Second World War. I have left them for future research when I will have maybe support and more time to do that. But in overall, I see more maybe differences than similarities, because, for example, in the field of communication, it was quite normal if we compare it with Soviet period, because this communication through intermediaries, through Nunciature in Berlin, he was quite regular. And of course, it was maybe under some surveillance of Nazi authorities, but more or less free. And Church in Lithuania could communicate with Rome during this period. And as I have shown in my presentation, Soviet period was really different in this regard. And also the Vatican, my feeling is that Vatican also, the Holy See, has treated Nazi Germany as more or less, I would dare to say, more or less normal state with whom it can, in some way, to negotiate, to make some decisions in the field of the church. And when it comes to Soviet Union, after the war especially, we see total break of any relations, and this attitude in the Vatican towards the Soviet Union is, I would dare to say, a bit different, maybe even very different, as a regime which can't be in any way negotiable And this institutional memory and this experience from the interwar period was also maybe very important in this regard, because people who acted in this field after the war in Vatican Curia on these issues, for example, Cardinal Pizzardo or the same Pope, Pius XII, they have a lot of experience to deal with Soviet Union in interwar period. Thank you.
Thank you. So this was the last statement of our morning session. Now we are going to have a break. And after the break, we will continue with the second panel. I think that the discussion will continue also in the second panel. So please, you're welcome to stay for the afternoon program. I thank you for your patience. And see you later.
Okay, so dear colleagues, guests, I would like to ask you to take a seat here in the conference room. And once again, let me welcome you at the second panel of our international research workshop focusing on the policy of the Pius XII to the states of the Eastern and Central Europe. As I can see in the room, there are some new faces, which we are really glad that the program of this seminar was attractive for you to come. So I have one obligation. It is regarding with the GDPR. So please, I will read the announcement, which is very important. Dear guests, as Nations Memory Institute would like to ensure compliance with General Data Protection Regulation, known as GDPR, we would like to inform you that the discussion will be recorded by audiovisual means. Full details of the processing of personal data can be found outside the entrance to the hall. If you have any questions, you can contact the responsible person listed above. Thank you for your comprehension. And right now, I would like to follow the program of today's workshop, and I would like to invite Professor Emília Hrabovec, full professor and head of the Department of Christian Philosophy and Historical Sciences at Comenius University in Bratislava, Roman Catholic Theological Faculty of St. Cyril and Methodius. She will present her speech, and Professor Hrabovec, the floor is yours, you can take it. I will just very briefly inform you that Professor Hrabovec is one of the best scientists dealing with the policy of the Holy See. She's the member of the Pontifical Committee for Historical Sciences in Vatican, also the Collegium Carolinum in Munich, the scientific board of the Revue de Histoire Ecclesiastique, and also some other very important board, and she's also visiting professor and research fellow at the University of Leuven, La Sapienza Università di Roma, Istituto Storico Italiano Germanico, and also Institute für Ost- and Südosteuropa-Forschung in Regensburg, and she is also one of the main organizers of this workshop. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, when the communists in winter 1947-48 definitely took over the absolute power in Czechoslovakia, and the regime soon after unleashed an offensive against all enemies, the Catholic Church, though a victim of continuous individual harassments, Technika большая. So let us continue. So after the definitive communist takeover, when the regime unleashed an offensive against all enemies, the Catholic Church, though a victim of continuous individual harassments, remained initially surprisingly spared from the harshest blows. The regime, well aware of the numerical and moral force of the Catholics and of the delicacy of the Catholic question for its international image, signaled rather willingness to make arrangements in exchange for the Church's declaration in favor of the regime. The main goal of this main tendue, outstretched hand, was to consolidate and legitimize the power before launching the main assault. This game of hide and seek of the regime complicated the defining of strategies of the papal diplomacy in front of the communist regime in Czechoslovakia. The general doctrinal and moral line drawn by the Pope was clear. Communism was intrinsically perverse, e intrinsecamente perverso, in opposition to the divine and the natural law, and a lethal threat to the Church, so that no collaboration with it was possible. This general moral line of the Pope was shared by everybody in the Curia. In concrete terms, however, uncertainty persisted among the papal diplomats about what was going to happen and what was to be done. The tactics of the communists is immensely disconcerting. Chargé d'affaires of the Holy See in Prague, Gennaro Verolino, wrote in May 1948, confessing later that, I quote, "Only God knew what was going to happen later, and the worst might be feared." End of the quotation. In this situation, the fundamental dilemma of the Vatican diplomacy consisted in the tension between the natural inclination rooted in the moral conviction to react with principled resistance and the pragmatic diplomatic effort sprung from the sense of responsibility to maintain the diplomatic intercourse as long as possible in the hope to find a way to protect the menaced interests of the Church, or at least to mitigate the impact of the persecution. Who might know the German language, this is the dilemma between Verantwortungsethik und Gesinnungsethik. The ethics sprung from the responsibility and the ethics sprung from the moral conviction, between principled resistance and pragmatic diplomatic stance. The Italian ambassador to the Holy See, reporting to his minister on the occasion of the visit in the Vatican in November 1948 of the Hungarian bishop Gyula Csapik, whose conciliatory attitude towards the communist regime was in contrast to the intransigence of Cardinal József Mindszenty, grasped the essence of the problem when he wrote, I cite, and I would like to have the first slide. In the Vatican, they think that in times of persecution, there are always two possible lines of conduct, intransigence and adaptation. The second line is able to save, at least for some time, some things, but has to sacrifice others, compromising perhaps even the principles. The first one, on the other hand, can lead to a total loss of positions, including the most essential ones, but it saves completely the principles, is full of moral grandeur, and contains the germ of the future reconstruction. End of the quotation. Faced with such fundamental issues, the Roman Curia was not a monolith. While in the Secretary of State a certain wait-and-see attitude and the effort to save the diplomatic dialogue still prevailed, other dicasteries prepared rather for an open confrontation with the communist regime. For some time, both attitudes coexisted. In the very first instructions sent to Prague after 25th of February 1948, the Secretary for Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs, Foreign Minister, Domenico Tardini, advised the papal diplomat to protest against every infringement of the church rights and to maintain a close contact with the key personalities in the episcopate. The problem was, however, that the bishops themselves were not united in how to respond to the question what to do. A clear line of division separated above all the Slovak episcopate from the bishops in the Czech lands. The trauma of Munich, the sufferings of the period of occupation, and the sympathies for the idealized Soviet liberators, facilitated by the liberal socialist and communist tendencies traditionally dominant in the Czech milieu, had resulted after the war in a strong shift to the left in the Czech society, an emotional inclination towards the East, and a landslide communist victory in the elections in 1946. In the post-war euphoria, not even the Czech Catholics, weakened by a deep secularization of the Czech society, remained immune to a strong wave of pro-Soviet and pro-left sympathies and dreams of harmony between Christianity and socialism as a way to a more just and progressive society. I would like to have another slide. portraits of Stalin on the walls of church institutions. We can see the reception room of Archbishop Beran with two portraits, that of President Beneš and that of Generalissimus Stalin, via in January 1947. So portraits of Stalin on the walls of church institutions, the Soviet anthem played at church celebrations, close personal contacts between the highest church and communist representatives, and celebratory articles on the October Revolution long before February 1948 were visible signs of this attitude. Another slide. Here you can see the Archbishop Beran with the communist functionaries, the General Secretary of the party, Rudolf Slansky, and the Minister of Information or Propaganda Minister, Václav Kopecký. The Slovak historical memory, on the contrary, perceived the post-war developments in the light of the involuntary loss of the own statehood, of political reprisals, anti-Catholic measures launched by the People's Democratic regime in Slovakia already in 1945, and a gradual takeover by the Communist Party, which the large majority of Slovak population clearly rejected. Another slide. Archbishop Kmetko captured in a nutshell the general sentiment of defeat and menace among the Slovak population when he said, another slide, that the situation in Slovakia might not be the hell yet, but it probably already was the purgatory. Might not be the hell yet, but it probably already was the purgatory. In this situation of general exacerbation and alienation from the state imposed from outside, the relation to the state was expressed by Archbishop Kmetko, as he said, at present, the Slovaks accept the Czechoslovak Republic because they have no other choice. If they could have their own independent state, they would naturally prefer it. End of the quotation. So, in this situation of general exacerbation and alienation from the state imposed from outside, the Church in Slovakia, above all the strong personalities of the older generation of bishops, defended the hard line of resistance and refused any negotiation with the communist regime. On the other side of the river Morava, the unconditional identification with the Czechoslovak state as a Czech national state, and mostly also with the socialist ideal, made it more difficult to reject the outstretched hand of the regime. All the more that, unlike the Slovak bishops, who could lean on the vivid faith of their faithful, the Czech ones had to cope with the religious indifference of the secularized society and the consequences of the expulsion of the Sudeten Germans that reduced significantly the number of Catholics and filled the borderlands with heterogeneous inhabitants mostly devoid of any bonds with the Church. Therefore, the Czech bishops, or at least most of the Czech bishops, defended the necessity to make an agreement with the state. The Archbishop of Prague, Josef Beran himself, nominated in 1947 as a candidate of the People's Democratic Government, oscillated for months between the natural inclination for a national patriotic commitment in favor of the Czechoslovak state and the sincere devotion to the socialist ideal on one side, and the resistance against the communist pressure on the other side, that gained the upper hand, not without the influence of the Vatican diplomacy, only in 1949. Significantly, in his public appeal pronounced at the peak of the February crisis 1948, Archbishop Beran did not take a clear anti-communist stance, but invited the faithful to realize the socialist ideal, the desired socialist ideal, in an evolutionary way. Tardini, the foreign minister of the Holy See, commented on it with the words that it contained, I quote, statements upon which it would be possible to make more than one critical remark, and that in the days of confusion of ideas, it would be good for the South when the most reverend pastors would distinguish themselves for clear ideas, above all when they touch points connected to the Catholic doctrine. End of the quotation. with unconcealed criticism of the Holy See, met some deeply rooted relics of post-Josephinist attitudes in the clergy. Above all, the deeply rooted inclination to search for favor and protection of state authorities. When the newly elected Archbishop of Olomouc, Josef Matocha, invited prominent communist guests to his consecration, Verolino, chargé d'affaires of the Holy See in Prague, clearly instructed by Tardini, exhorted the episcopate to avoid undignified ostentation of friendship with the government, and left Olomouc immediately after the liturgical celebration in order to visit the Slovak bishops Kmitko and Wojtaszak, who had not arrived to Olomouc because unwilling to meet the communist ministers Čepička and Nejerli. A major diversity of opinion between the Vatican diplomat and some bishops arose upon the question of an agreement with the state. Neither the Holy See excluded an agreement with Prague, but insisted on two conditions. It should not limit itself to some financial questions proposed by the state, but include tangible concessions regarding the liberty of the Church. And the negotiations should be led by the Holy See as the natural partner of the state and not by the episcopate, far more fragile in the face of the political power. When the government refused Verolino's offer, but the majority in the episcopate was still ready to negotiate, Verolino, in perfect harmony with Pope Pius XII's warning of empty promises of wolves in sheep's clothing, did not conceal his critical stance. Next. Well, thank you very much for the next slide, Verolino. And the next one. To tell the truth, I cannot understand why the Archbishop accepted to make these negotiations, Verolino wondered, being convinced that there is no probability or hope that by making concessions it will be possible to ensure the future, as persecution will come either way. Verolino considered it far more important to put an end to the present confusion and to do it before the number of ecclesiastics trapped in the networks of our enemies increases, and while the faithful still look with confidence to the Church. End of the quotation. So we can see clearly the Holy See did not consider persecution as the major threat. Not persecution, not martyrdom are the major threat. The major threat is confusion of ideas, disorientation, fog. This is the major concern. Verolino's predictions revealed to be right. In June 1948, the Central Committee of the Communist Party presented the first complete program of its anti-Catholic policy that envisaged the reduction of the Church to an obedient and progressive national church in the service of the regime as an intermediary stage before the planned decline of the religion. In order to achieve this aim, conflict should be stirred up between the clergy and the episcopate and between the patriotic and the reactionary clergy. The dynamics of the struggle against the Church was accelerated by the resolution of the Common Forum from June 1948 on the hardening of the class struggle, and by the Yugoslav crisis that led to a feverish search for nationalist and Titoist deviations in the ranks of Czechoslovak communists, and induced Verolino to deplore that the Czech mentality was too weak and blade, and the Czechoslovak communists had not the courage and the temperament of their southern brethren to go the Yugoslav way. The most important moment of radicalization, however, was the trial against Cardinal Vincent in Hungary at the beginning of 1949 that unleashed a wave of attacks on the episcopate and the Holy See also in Czechoslovakia. In his famous speech in the consistory after the conviction of Cardinal Vincenti, Pius XII said that the Church tolerated every form of government as long as it was not in contrast to the divine and human rights. If such a contrast existed, however, the bishops and the faithful had the sacred obligation in their conscience to resist the unjust laws. On 14 March 1949, after a papal audience, Tardini sent a clear instruction to the Prague Internunciature that exhorted the episcopate to abandon useless negotiations and to adopt a clear position able to provide direction to and inspire courage in the faithful. The return of Verolino, absent for 4 months, to Prague in March 1949 was another sign of tightening against the regime. Verolino, in Rome received by the Pope, solidified his conviction that compromises, concessions, and negotiations without results with communists were not only useless, but harmful, because while not impeding the realization of the communist plans, they hindered the Church in denouncing openly the persecution, allowed the regime to drive a wedge in the ranks of the episcopate, generated confusion among the faithful, and deprived the Church of her unique, effective human weapon, the possibility to mobilize the public opinion in the world that would otherwise be left in the illusion that an agreement between the Church and the communist regime was possible. The strategy how to face the confrontation with the regime that Verolino brought with him from Rome could be summarized in the following points. First, in his eschatological vision of history, Pope Pius XII considered the confrontation with communism an apocalyptic struggle of primarily spiritual character. Consequently, the main task of the Church was to prepare and enforce the faithful spiritually by the intensification of religious life. Second, Verolino encouraged the bishops to abandon the traditional post-Josephinist search for protection of the government and the idea of a relatively secure and comfortable life with a stable income, to give up resultless talks with the regime and to raise the voice publicly against the violations of the rights of the Church, to act according to canonical laws and the proper conscience, for example, nominating parish priests without taking account of civil authorities, to address the clergy and the faithful with clearly formulated instructions, and to proceed promptly against pro-communist priests with canonical punishments in order to break the public influence capable of confusing the people. Once more, confusion is the major threat. Third, in order to recast the Catholic hierarchy as a resistance church, the Holy See tried to complete the College of Bishops by elevating the apostolic administrators to the dignity of bishops, avoiding at the same time the nominations of residential bishops that required negotiations with the state. And to promote the most authoritative bishop in Slovakia, Jan Wojtaszak, the bishop of Spiš, the only one considered capable of talking, I quote, clearly and unambiguously to Archbishop ad personam, in order to grant him a greater authority in face of the regime, but also among his overcautious and frightened brethren in the episcopate. This became the general Vatican strategy for the Church behind the Iron Curtain. The tightening of diplomatic positions was accompanied by the clear tendency to select or support strong personalities at the lead of the dioceses, able to resist the greatest pressures. If the period of possible negotiations might have preferred the Chapikians, the hour of Lepanto required the Vincentians. This attitude corresponded perfectly with the fundamental inclination of Pius XII, who had been since 1946 repeatedly admonishing Catholics not to excuse their fare by calling it caution, and had been exhorting them to be in awe only of God and to fear nothing but fear itself. 4. In order to maintain a personal contact with the local church, Verolino traveled all over the country, visiting every diocese and discussing the strategies of defense with the bishops. The most delicate part of his flying mission consisted in delivering special instructions imparted by the Pope gradually from October 1948 that provided the bishops with particular faculties normally reserved to the Holy See that should enable the creation of clandestine church structures able to govern the church if the diocesan bishops were arrested or otherwise impeded, and the functioning of the inner church life in extraordinary circumstances in which regular canonical prescriptions could not be maintained. 5. Finally, the Holy See and her official and unofficial diplomatic networks all over the world tried to sustain the suffering church by a mobilization of universal Catholic solidarity, the world public opinion, and interventions of the Western governments. In spite of the omnipresent Cold War rhetorics, this Catholic anti-communist mobilization, similarly as the confrontation with the communist main tendu, outstretched hand policy in the 30s, and the interests of the great powers in the 30s, similarly like this, also in the 50s, this mobilization efforts encountered, however, egoistic economic and political self-interest of the West and growing silent acceptance of the vision of the world and the increasing influence of neo-Marxism in the West that limited her activity. In spite of the gradual radicalization of the anti-Catholic measures of the regime, as well as of the attitude of the Holy See, in spring 1949, a clear public stance of the bishops continued to be missing. While the representatives of the episcopate justified the prudence with the effort not to offer a pretext to the regime to arrest hundreds of priests, Verolino evaluated differently. Evidently, they are frightened. Verolino considered the period of April-May 1949 particularly appropriate for a public protest. Like Pizzardo at the Economic Conference in Genoa in 1922, with regard to Soviet Russia, Verolino hoped that the urgent Czechoslovak need of foreign credits could induce Prague to come to some concessions, all the more in the international situation in which the discussion of the Minsanti case at the United Nations enhanced both the sensibility of the world opinion for the Church behind the Iron Curtain and the nervosity of the communist leadership preoccupied with its international reputation. And the just concluded Berlin crisis, concluded in April 1949, arose worries in Prague because of possible changes in the attitude of the West towards the crucial German question. The long-awaited attack at the church was unleashed on 10th June of 1949, when the regime launched the so-called Catholic Action, a tentative to found a schismatic national church subjected to the regime. The imminent danger finally mobilized the episcopate that reacted with a pastoral letter that, for the first time without mincing words, invited the Catholics not to let themselves be deceived by an anti-Christian ideology willing to substitute religion with Marxism. The attack on the church produced unexpected consequences in Slovakia. The Slovak people, exacerbated by accumulated injustices of the past years and touched on the most sensitive point, reacted spontaneously with open resistance and an open uprising. One armed unit tried to arrest the priests who had read the pastoral letter. Although the government shut off the whole Slovakia, dramatic news on violent turmoil and a popular uprising soon reached the West and for many days filled both the first pages of newspapers, including L'Osservatore Romano, and the dispatches of Western diplomats. Verolino remained profoundly impressed. With the Austrian envoy to Prague, Rudolf Zeman, he shared his, I quote, great admiration for the Slovak Catholic population that distinguished itself in this critical situation by such a singular power of faith and courage that to this extent he had not met in the Czech population. End of the quotation. Verolino himself did not remain passive. Even before the pastoral letter of the bishops, he sent a harsh note to the foreign ministry, and when he had a hunch that the ministry was preparing a note of response with the proposal to open negotiations with the Holy See on the new delimitation of dioceses pending since 1918, intended as a maneuver to prevent, under the pretext of ongoing negotiations, a solemn condemnation of the schismatic Catholic action by the Holy See, he cabled to the Vatican asking for a rapid condemnation of the movement in order to enlighten Catholic consciences and prevent confusion in Catholic faith. Once more, confusion as the greatest fear. Pius XII, who read all the reports of his diplomat in Prague and followed the events with great pain, decided to act immediately to prevent further confusion and to delimit clearly the boundaries between Catholic and Marxist ideas. On 20 June of 1949, the Holy Office issued a decree that condemned the Catholic action launched by the communist regime in Czechoslovakia and warned that Catholics who knowingly and voluntarily took part in these activities incurred excommunication. This was the unknown prologue of the well-known universal anti-communist excommunication decree that followed on the 1st of July 1949. Until now, you can read in all international scientific reports and scientific literature on the excommunication decree from the 1st of July 1949, but you will find nothing, I repeat, nothing on the first excommunication decree from the 20th of June 1949. Also, this is a clear illustration of the importance of the research on the East Central European history in the Cold War. On 25 of June 1949, Verolino started a 4-day trip to Slovakia, in the course of which he visited all the bishops with whom he discussed the possibilities of defense against the danger of schism. Although he did not take part in the rebellion in Slovakia, his presence in the country and the contact with the bishops enraged the regime. Against all diplomatic rules, his car was blocked twice by the police. After the return to Prague, Verolino protested, but the protest was rejected with the argument that the journey had been undertaken without giving an advance notice to the ministry. The tentative to shut off Slovakia from the outer world is clearly present. The 2 decrees of the Holy See and the courageous reaction of the Slovak faithful accelerated the crisis of the Catholic action that soon resulted in a failure. The regime found the first scapegoat in the hated representative of the Holy See. Verolino was indicted for having prepared, together with Cardinal Mindszenty, an anti-state plot in Hungary and for having been sent to Czechoslovakia to incite the faithful against the state and to prevent any agreement between the church and the state. In the heat of the battle, Prague did not even notice that Verolino, together with Nuncio Rota, had been expelled from Hungary already in spring 1945, as we have already heard in the contribution of Professor Fejérdy. It is before the appointment of Mindszenty to Archbishop of Esztergom. Quite right, however, was the judgment of the regime that Verolino really was the driving force of the church resistance against the communist regime. On 13 July 1949, upon an urgent request of Prague, Verolino had to leave the country. The Czechoslovak government declined its approval to both designated successors of Verolino and did not recognize the diplomatic status to the secretary Ottavio de Liva. Next slide. Who thus found himself in a difficult position. He was unable to access the foreign ministry, remained alone in the internunciatura without even the secretary and the driver both arrested, was observed day and night by secret agents, and confronted with an aggressive propaganda offensive launched by the regime against the Holy See, accused to be the greatest enemy of Czechoslovakia. Under these circumstances, de Liva withdrew almost completely from the public space. With the bishops and the superiors of the religious orders, he communicated by secret couriers. Several times, he was able to meet on secret places with some Czech bishops, but he lost every connection to Slovakia that was systematically isolated from the outer world by the central Czechoslovak state authorities. In spite of the difficulties, the Pope and the State Secretariat considered the last fragments of news de Liva could offer, and above all the very fact of the presence of de Liva in the country, so important that in November 1949, Tardini instructed the Leva to do everything to remain on the spot. Another slide, please. The point of greatest interest for the Holy See today is that you will not be forced to leave the country. This would be extremely lamentable, all the more in the everything else than improbable eventuality that the government would decline the visum both to the Most Reverend Monsignor Rossi and to some other papal diplomat. Your departure would thus mean that the Holy See would lose almost every possibility to communicate with the episcopate and to receive information and give instructions. In order to avoid it, you should possibly limit your activities with regard to the government, avoiding everything that could draw too much attention to the papal representation. End of the quotation. The most important topic that filled the Leva's reports to the Vatican were the anti-religious laws enacted by the Parliament in October 1949 that transformed all the priests who were allowed to perform priestly functions into state employees paid by the state, on the condition that they made the oath of allegiance to the state and received a state approval. De Leva was well aware of the maliciousness of this way of proceeding in a situation in which the Church, after the confiscation of all church properties, did not possess any resources more to maintain her priests independently from the state. Another slide. The schismatic movement of the so-called Catholic, No, it must be some other. The schismatic movement of the so-called, yes, this is the right one, excuse me for the confusion. The schismatic movement of the so-called Catholic action was a small thing in front of the diabolically insidious action conducted by this communist government in these days. Unfortunately, a serious peril is taking shape that a new schismatic church will be formed, if not by propaganda, then by material arguments. The Leva confessed openly that the clergy, isolated from the bishops, intimidated by arrests, and concerned about the elementary material survival, was disoriented, felt existentially threatened, and was liable to succumb to the pressures of the regime. Until now, this clergy had more or less the possibility to live in a certain prosperity. Until now, this clergy had more or less the possibility to live in a certain prosperity. After the nationalization of all immobile church properties, however, for the major part of the clergy, the conqueror represents the only means of living. Particularly the older priests think that declining the new increase in salary would mean to be condemned to suffer hunger. So if they were not mobilizable by a Catholic action, they were mobilizable by existential threat. De Leva identified one of the most serious reasons of disorientation of one part of the clergy in the impossibility of communication between the episcopate and the clergy. He insisted, therefore, on the Holy See to charge the Vatican radio with providing for the necessary communication. In the course of the next weeks, the Vatican radio actually transmitted a long series of broadcasts that informed on the situation, read pastoral letters and instructions issued by the bishops, and warned the priests not to take the oath of allegiance to the state. Although the Vatican radio demonstrated an extraordinary commitment, the State Secretariat of the Holy See soon made the first efforts to moderate and break its tone, and in order to protect the local church, instructed it not to transmit documents of the episcopate before they had been transmitted by other radio stations of news or newspapers. Initially, De Leva was convinced that the bishops should reject the anti-religious laws. In the course of time, however, he began to be more aware of the bitter truth of reality. First of all, of the fact that while in Slovakia and in some parts of Moravia, as he hoped, the faithful could take care of their priests that would not sign the prescribed oath of allegiance. In the rest of the Czech lands, with a low percentage of Catholics, such a generosity could not be evaded. so that above all the older clergy would remain without any means of living. When the bishops, with a common letter, finally instructed the clergy that they were allowed to accept the state salary and take the prescribed oath on the condition that a formula, as far as it is not in conflict with the divine law and the natural rights of man, would be added, De Leva commented the decision as a cautious middle way, able to prevent inner divisions in the clergy. The Holy See remained cautiously reserved too. Tardini informed De Leva that the Holy See, I quote, abstained from taking position in this regard, letting the delicate questions under examination to be resolved by the most reverend ordinaries, on whose sense of responsibility she has a full confidence. End of quotation. In other words, although the Holy See would have undoubtedly preferred a firm stance without compromises, she left the ultimate decision to the bishops themselves, being convinced that they knew best the local situation, but also that nobody could be forced to martyrdom. A similar strategy of non-imposition from above and of encouraging the bishops to maintain their own responsibility was applied with regard to the special faculties. And now the last slide. Here we see the first side of the document with the so-called special faculties of the Holy See. The Holy See kept stressing that in concrete terms, the prelates were free to do as they see fit for the spiritual good of the flock entrusted to them. If some authors, like Hans-Jakob Stehle, criticize the secret faculties and the plan for building up a secret hierarchy as a flawed policy imposed from outside and unable to resolve local situations, the research demonstrates that these measures, by the way, not for the first time applied under Pius XII, but already under Pius XI in the interwar period in the Soviet Union and in Mexico, that these measures were to be employed with extreme caution and left a great room for personal responsibility of the bishops, who were never forced to accept ready solutions from above. The best confirmation of the liberty the particular church enjoyed in this regard was the fact that the clandestine church in Slovakia was in the end not built according to the ideas drawn up in the Roman Curia, but in an independent way, only afterwards confirmed by the Supreme Catholic Authority, confirmed in 1954 and built up in 1950-51. In the spring of 1950, and to conclude, the regime prepared for the harshest attacks on the Catholic Church and did not need a Vatican testimony. In the middle of March 1950, immediately after the removal of Foreign Minister Clementis, contrary to such a brachial solution, De Leva was expelled from the country and the Holy See lost the last possibility of direct contact with the local church, remaining dependent on reports transmitted by the Western, above all Italian and Austrian diplomats, and the information provided by the Slovak and the Czech exiles. Thank you very much for your attention.
I would also like to thank Professor Hrabovec for excellent lecture. And I would like to invite my colleague from Nations Memory Institute, Dr. Beáta Katrebová Blehová, to say some words about the topic Slovak exile and the Slovak question in the context of the nascent Cold War. Bea, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a little bit another topic than we used to listen in previous presentations, but in a broader context, it belongs to the whole issue. After the end of the Second World War, due to the decision of the victorious powers, Slovakia was reintegrated into the restored Czechoslovakia belonging to the Soviet sphere of influence. Through the establishment of People's Democratic National Front regime with a left-wing and pro-Soviet orientation, the gradual Bolshevization of the security apparatus, homogenization of the population through forced displacement of national minorities and deprivation of their fundamental rights, anti-Catholic measures and retributive justice, and finally, the application of the ideology of socialism in the economic and social order, the year 1945 marked an unprecedented historical breakthrough for Slovakia and the beginning of the development that led to the complete seizure of power by the communists in February 1948. One of the lasting consequences of this historical breakthrough was the emergence of the first Slovak political emigration in the modern history of Slovakia. The common denominator of this historically first wave of emigration for political reasons was the struggle against communism and the idea of independence of Slovakia. After the arrival of the first Slovak refugees abroad, centers of Slovak exile began to form and exile organizations started to emerge around the autumn of 1945. The Slovak Revolutionary Resistance can be considered the first Slovak exile organization, which was established in the American occupation zone of Austria at the end of 1945. The Slovak Revolutionary Resistance was the first major organization of the anti-communist resistance. In the second half of the 1940s, under its leadership and with the help of the Western secret services, networks of so-called agent couriers were created and organized illegal crossings across the Austrian-Czechoslovak state border in order to gather information from the state and security authorities in Slovakia. Secret networks transporting intelligence material from Slovakia to the West existed until about 1950, when their main actors were exposed by the Czechoslovak state security, brought before communist courts, and in some cases sentenced to death. Among the most dynamic figures of the Slovak exile was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the First Slovak Republic, University Professor of International Law, Ferdinand Jučanský, who fell into disfavor with Berlin in summer of 1940 because his idea of a neutral Slovak foreign policy conflicted with Nazi hegemony in Central Europe. During his short stay in the French occupation zone of Austria in the summer of 1945, he drafted a memorandum which, in its basic outlines, presented his political conception of the position of Slovakia in the post-war Europe. Jučanský was convinced that Czechoslovakia was restored in contradiction to the principles of the international law, which is the right to self-determination of each nation guaranteed by the programmatic declarations of the victorious powers such as the Atlantic Charter, the Four Freedoms, or the Charter of the United Nations. He therefore asked the great powers not to treat Slovakia otherwise than as a defeated state, and to conclude a peace treaty with it. He demanded that a plebiscite be held in Slovakia under the control of the Allied powers, in which the citizens living on the territory of Slovakia should express in which state they wanted to live. At the end of 1945, he founded in Rome the Slovak Action Committee, later renamed in Slovak Liberation Committee. He drafted 3 comprehensive memoranda for the Paris Peace Conference, founded the bulletin Slovak Information Service, which informed the Western world about the situation in Slovakia. In the spring of 1947, he launched a radio broadcast to Slovakia north of Rome, initiated the establishment of a Slovak army unit in exile on the model of the Polish army in exile of General Vladislav Anders, maintained contacts with the Slovak underground movement, and flooded the Western world with dozens of memoranda, petitions, requests, or letters. The second political center of Slovak exile was formed around the former Slovak envoy to the Holy See, Karol Sidor, who was granted political asylum by the Vatican after the end of the war until his departure for Canada in 1950. Even during the war, Sidor's active diplomacy on behalf of the persecuted Jews in Slovakia, his anti-German attitudes, and his support for the Catholic Central European Federation brought him into diplomatic and ecclesiastical contacts with, among others, earlier diplomats working in Rome, Christian democratic Italian politicians, and diplomats from Central Europe, especially Polish and Hungarian. The Holy See quietly recognized him as the representative of Slovakia even after 1945, and expected him to form a government in exile. However, misinformation about the uprising and the situation in post-war Slovakia as well as Sidor's personal problems in connection with his family arrival in Italy, caused him to think for some time about returning to Slovakia, where he wanted to organize the Catholic wing of Democratic Party and re-enter internal politics. Sidor spent the first 2 post-war years providing assistance to Slovak refugees. He was involved in the Pontifical Auxiliary Commission, Pontificia Commissione di Assistenza, and he provided his own car for the purposes of the 3rd Pontifical Mission for Refugees in Germany and Austria. The immediate impetus for the activation of political emigration in Sidor's circle was given by the February coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia. Another important impulse was the influx of new political emigrants from Czechoslovakia, mostly from non-communist National Front parties, including Slovak Democrats. Last but not least, the political activism of Sidor was also influenced by the fact that the French government began to reassess its relationship to the Slovak exile after the February events, and was willing to support the Slovak exile under Sidor's leadership, provided that a center would be established in Paris. Slovak National Council Abroad was founded in the autumn of 1948 in Rome by reorganizing the already existing Slovak National Council in London, which was, as part of the Slovak anti-Nazi and anti-Beneš resistance, defended the right of Slovaks to state independence during the war. The Slovak National Council Abroad espoused the idea of an independent democratic Slovakia within a federalized Europe and fought for its liberation from communism. It was recognized by the Slovak League of America, so one of the biggest Slovak American compatriot organization in the United States of America, which provided it with facilities and financial support, and in 1952 established its branch in Washington. The program of the Slovak National Council Abroad was not based on the continuity of the First Slovak Republic. National and state sovereignty derived from the self-determining right of nations under international law. The main goals of its activities were, first, to work alongside Western democracies for the liberation of Slovakia from communism and for the establishment of a democratic state as an equal member of the international community. Secondly, to represent the Slovak liberation movement before the world public. Thirdly, to organize social work and aid for the Slovak refugees. And fourthly, to establish in due time all such bodies that would ensure the fullness of Slovak state life. It had offices in London, Paris, Munich, Madrid. We are talking about the special position of Spain after the Second World War in the anti-communist fight. So in Madrid was a very important branch of Slovak National Council Abroad, and the leader was, it was headed by the former Slovak envoy to Spain, Josef Cieker. Later in Washington, also in Rome, of course, later in Washington and Montreal. Another important objective of the Slovak National Council Abroad was the promotion of the federalization of Europe, as well as participation in the federalization processes. Sidor was well acquainted with the ideas of Pope Pius XII, who supported integration processes in post-war Europe, provided that they will be based on Christian principles, in particular Catholic social teaching, and the principles of solidarity, natural law, and human dignity. The Pope was convinced that a unifying Europe should not form a kind of supranational superstate, but should be based on a synthesis of national identities and transnational solidarity, reflecting the Christian spirit, according to the motto, either Europe will be Christian or it will be not at all. Pius XII welcomed the adoption of the Marshall Plan for the reconstruction of Europe. At the same time, however, he stressed that reconstruction must be the goal for achieving European independence and must not be misused as an instrument against the Soviet expansionism. In a letter to President Harry Truman in July 1948, the Pope suggested that Europe should be rebuilt in a spirit of cooperation and independence, and he also mentioned the fact that to achieve true independence it was necessary not only to deal with economic reconstruction, but also to adopt a security strategy for Europe. He reiterated, however, that an aid program cannot be successful if it does not take into account the need for a person's conversion to God. The Pope supported the emergence of Christian democratic political parties and their integration into higher supranational groups. These were, first of all, the federalist movement of Christian democratic parties, groups and personalities, founded in 1947 under the French name Nouvelle Équipe Internationale, which acted as a European forum for broad cooperation between Christian democratic political parties. Robert Bichet, a French minister and a member of the leadership of the Republican People's Movement, with whom Sidor was personally acquainted and met him several times, became Secretary General of this Nouvelle Équipe Internationale, following the Italian model of Democrazia Cristiana and of course also of the French Mouvement Républicain Populaire. Sidor founded a political party called Slovak Christian Democracy and sought its admission into the aforementioned movement. Sidor's Christian Democratic Party did not become part of Nouvelle Équipe Internationale because Sidor disagreed with its inclusion under Une Équipe Nationale Czechoslovaque, so under the Czechoslovak National Group, and in exile he was unwilling to participate in any organization under the common heading of Czechoslovakia. Sidor's Christian democracy did not even become part of the Christian Democratic Union of Central Europe, founded in June 1950 in New York by Christian-oriented exiled politicians from East Central Europe. The Christian Democratic Union of Central Europe was represented by the Czechoslovak People's Party, Československá strana lidová, who successfully boycotted the adoption of Sidor's proposal. Now I would like to turn attention to a very important chapter of the existence of Slovak exile, Slovak exile in the United States in the context of the Cold War, in the context of the post-war status quo and the great power divisions of spheres of influence. The position of the Slovak exile with its program of state independence was most difficult in the center of world politics in the United States. The attitude of the United States, which traditionally considered Czechoslovakia as the own child of liberal democracy, was unchanged in relation to the order of Central Europe. The US government, therefore, openly supported and financed the Czechoslovak exile associated with the Council of Free Czechoslovakia, founded in February 1949 in Washington, whose main goal was a united Czechoslovak state. It was dominated by the Czech National Socialists, mostly close associates of the former President Edvard Beneš, as well as political parties of the pre-February National Front. In doing so, it is questionable to what extent they were co-responsible for the communist takeover of power in Czechoslovakia. The Slovak Democrats, who won an overwhelming majority of Slovak votes in the last semi-free elections in Slovakia in May 1946, were represented by the former chairman of the Slovak National Council, Josef Letrich, who in the Council of Free Czechoslovakia failed to enforce either the principle of federation or even the principle of equality, and finally withdrew from it. For these reasons, it was understandable that the Slovak National Council abroad found it necessary to protest against the claims of the Council of Free Czechoslovakia to speak on behalf of the Slovak nation before the world public. In October 1949, its leadership published a memorandum on the political aims of the Council of Free Czechoslovakia, which rejected its claims to represent the Slovak question before the Western world. The memorandum was delivered to all Western governments, and it is considered one of the most important achievements of the exile organization in its early years. On the threshold of the Cold War, the Slovak political exile around Sidor quickly grasped the weight of the American factor. For this reason, as well as because of the strong Slovak American expatriate community, the headquarters of the Slovak National Council abroad was moved to the United States at the beginning of 1950s. Sidor did not succeed in emigrating to the United States, but he managed to settle in neighboring Canada. And in 1950, he organized a lecture tour in the United States, during which he personally visited State Department. The main purpose was not only the Slovak question itself, but above all to emphasize the fundamental anti-communism of the Slovak exile, which, with the onset of the Cold War, quickly understood the anti-communist attitudes were crucial to the goals of Slovak policy in the United States. The anti-communism of the Slovak National Council abroad was endorsed by the US government, which did not prevent it from continuing to be active in the United States. The Slovak National Council abroad was able to rely on the support of some American congressmen and senators who criticized the excessive US friendliness towards the Soviets and were convinced that Slovak anti-communism had deep roots. First of all, mention should be made of Republican Congressman Charles Joseph Kirsten, a Catholic of a fundamentally anti-communist orientation, who was a member of House of Representatives in the 40s and then in the 50s. He was convinced that the preservation of the Slovak Republic after the end of the Second World War would better serve US anti-communist goals in Central Europe than would a restored Czechoslovakia with a leftist and pro-Soviet government headed by President Beneš. In July 1951, before the Foreign Affairs Committee of the US Congress, Congressman Kirsten presented a concurrent resolution demanding the exercise of the right of self-determination and free elections in Slovakia. Kirsten was convinced that the importance of anti-communist underground movement in Slovakia. In July 1953, he arranged a visit by the Slovak National Council leadership to the State Department. They met the Director of East European Affairs, Volvod Burbu, and delivered a memorandum addressed to the Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. The purpose of the memorandum was to present the will of the Slovaks for an independent state, to emphasize the participation of the anti-communist struggle of Slovaks at home and abroad, and to request from the US government the same support for Slovaks in exile as was enjoyed by other nations from behind the Iron Curtain. The memorandum also included a request for the establishment of a separate Slovak broadcast in Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, so that an independent Slovak voice in the psychological warfare against communism could be heard. The State Department's response to the Slovak exiles initiative was not long in coming. It confirmed the US government's position that it would not change the status quo in Central Europe and that under a policy of non-predetermination, it would not be dragged into discussions about the future of enslaved peoples. In other words, the US government perceived the question of the relationship between Slovaks and Czechs as an internal matter of Czechoslovakia and put the anti-communist resistance in the foreground before the question of the self-determination. The other congressmen who supported the anti-communist struggle of the Slovak exile and the right to self-determination criticized the persecution of the church in Slovakia, spoke before the US Congress in defense of the rights of Slovaks, and showed a willingness to publish resolutions and memoranda in the Congressional Record, where Ray Madden, in 1951, chairman of the Congressional Committee to investigate the Katyn massacre, Elvin Bentley, Daniel Flood, Philip Philbin, Tadeusz Machrovitz, Barrett O'Hara, Michael Fagan, and others. Some of them became members of the Select Committee of Communist Aggression, which was established in March 1954 under the leadership of Congressman Kirsten, and which was also investigating the crimes of the communist regime, of communists in Slovakia from the autumn of 1944. Just with some words, an important part of Western anti-communist campaign was the so-called psychological warfare in the field of radio broadcasting, so the so-called white propaganda. The creation of the non-governmental organization National Committee for Free Europe took place in this context. The majority of the Slovak exile stood aside from these activities because the US government recognized only members of the Council of Free Czechoslovakia as leading anti-communist political refugees from Czechoslovakia. There were many memorandums from the Slovak Exile Organization and also from the American Slovak organization to the leadership of Radio Free Europe to establish Slovak broadcast, but they were not successful until 1993. So, the participation of Slovak immigrants in the role of witnesses to communist crimes during the investigation of the aforementioned Kirsten Committee on Communist Aggression can be considered an indisputable success. Substantial parts of their testimony were published in the final report to the US Congress submitted in 1955. In the first half of 1956, 5 concurrent resolutions were submitted by 5 congressmen. The campaign in favor of the imprisoned Slovak bishops was also successful. One of the first publications, which was published by Slovak National Council abroad in the United States, was personally delivered by Slovak diplomat Jozef Mikuš to well-known papal delegate Amleto Giovanni Cicognani during an audience in Washington in February 1953. It was subsequently circulated to many other governments and diplomatic posts where it attracted an attention. Particular attention aroused by the message from Slovak political prisoners, which, as an authentic testimony about the crimes of the communist regime in Slovakia, was in early 1957 at great risk smuggled across the Iron Curtain to the free world. It was published in English and then sent to many redactions in the United States, and it was one of the most requested documents of the Slovak exile in the West. Well, I'm not going to mention the Hungarian-Polish events in 1956 because of lack of the time. The last chapter I would like to mention is the unsuccessful attempts to get member of one of the most important exile organizations, the Assembly of Captive European Nations. The unsuccessful attempts to gain membership in this assembly can be considered a failure of the Slovak exile. The umbrella organization of exiles from East Central Europe, founded in September 1954, under the auspices of the Free Europe Council, so under, let's say, under the auspices of American government, served as an important tribune for the anti-communist struggle of the exile representation of the nations behind the Iron Curtain on the world stage, apparently with an exception of the Slovaks. Czechoslovakia was represented by the Council of Free Czechoslovakia, which was the main reason why, despite repeated requests, the Slovak National Council abroad never granted the membership. It was also contrary to the principles of the organization, which presented itself as the authentic voice of the captured nations. The appearance of the Council of Free Czechoslovakia as a genuine voice of the Slovak nation was seen by Slovak National Council abroad as political usurpation of the policy of certain Czechs. There were also attempts of the Slovak diplomat and the leader, the chairman of the Slovak branch of Slovak National Council abroad in Washington, Jozef Mikuš, who personally met some leading figures in the Assembly of Captive European Nations. So first of all, he met the envoy of Free Latvia, Arnold Speke, and he had also contacts to Hungarian exile representatives, László Varga, Haida Nemet, and Georg Bakács Besényi, whom personally know Karol Sidor. He even met the General Secretary of Assembly, Nucicota, but without success. So this is the last point of my presentation, and I thank you for the attention.
I would also like to thank you, Beáta, for your speech. And according to the program, I would like to invite Mr. Michal Klakus from the Pastoral Institute in Toulon to present the speech, The Anti-Communist Crusade of Archbishop Jozef Gavlina. Just a small remark, this is the only one paper which will be translated. Mr. Klakus will speak in Polish, and we have here the interpreter who will translate it into English. And I would kindly like to ask you for the time discipline, because at 4 o'clock we really have to end, and we hope for some couple of minutes for the discussion. So please, floor is yours.
Na samym początku chciałbym podziękować pani profesor Hrabovec za zaproszenie i zaufanie pomimo nieznajomości języka angielskiego, a szanownym państwu za cierpliwość i uwagę w tym trudnym, poobiednim czasie siesty.
At the beginning, I would like to thank you to Ms. Hrabovec for the invitation and to all of the audience for the patience in this lazy afternoon.
Najpierw przypatrzmy się, kim był arcybiskup Gawlina.
Let's take a look shortly who the Archbishop Gawlina was.
Zdjęcie zrobione w 1959 roku. Widzimy człowieka zmęczonego życiem, można powiedzieć chorego.
This is picture taken in 1959. We can see a person who is tired of his life.
Gawlina nie mógł wrócić po wojnie do Polski i od 1949 roku został protektorem, opiekunem kilkumilionowej rzeszy Polaków poza granicami kraju.
Gawlina couldn't get back after the World War II to Poland, and in 1949 he became a protector of all the Poles living in emigration.
Prócz tego był opiekunem kongregacji mariańskiej, ale to jego zmęczenie wynikało z tego, że po II wojnie światowej starał się w Rzymie stworzyć swoistą antykomunistyczną krucjatę.
He was protector of a congregation, and actually his face was and he was tired because he was trying in Rome to establish an anti-communist organization.
Oczywiście nie zawsze był taki zmęczony. Tu go widzimy w 1921 roku, w roku, kiedy przyjął święcenia kapłańskie.
Not the whole life he was so tired. We can see this picture that comes from 1921 when he was named to the priest. Sorry.
W 1933 roku został biskupem polowym.
In 1933 he became a field bishop.
I z racji z tej funkcji w czasie II wojny światowej przebywał przez kilka miesięcy w Związku Sowieckim.
And because of this duty, he was staying in the on the territory of Soviet Union for a few months.
Tu widzimy go w lipcu 1942 roku w Kazachstanie.
We can see him in the July 32 in Kazakhstan on this picture.
I to wydarzenie z lipca zaważyło o jego antykomunistycznej postawie.
And actually this event had a great impact on his decision. An anti-communist state.
Był przerażony, bo widział dzieci, które ginęły z głodu i mrozu. Dzieci polskie deportowane.
He was shocked because he saw Polish children who were dying from hunger and cold in the Soviet Union territories.
Od tego czasu będzie mówił o zwalczaniu bezbożnej propagandy komunizmu, bezbożnym reżimie.
Since then, he's talking about fighting the godless communism, godless propaganda,
perfidnych metodach,
cruel methods,
a nawet o kulturkampfie na sposób hitlerowski.
and even Kulturkampf in the Nazi manner.
Czy arcybiskup Gawlina miał rację?
Was Archbishop Józef Gawlina right?
Co do krajów komunistycznych usłyszeliśmy o sytuacji w sesji dopołudniowej.
When it comes to the communistic country, we could hear the lectures in the noon sessions.
Wiadomo, że we wszystkich krajach istniały grupy katolików postępowych, uległych wobec władzy.
It is obvious that in many countries there were groups of progressive Catholics that were subordinated to the government.
Ale to, co przerażało Gawlinę, to, że ci katolicy, szczególnie z Polski, nawiązali kontakty z katolikami postępowymi, na przykład we Francji.
What scared Gawlina the most was the fact that the progressive Catholics from Poland started connecting with progressive Catholics, for example, from France.
Tu mamy zdjęcie rachunku, czy prośby o rachunek jednego z przywódców katolików postępowych, który był we Francji.
This is the picture of bill of one of the progressive Catholics who was in France.
I zwraca się do służb bezpieczeństwa w Polsce o zwrot kosztów.
And he was asking the security services in Poland to cost return.
Kolacji z czasopismem Esprit z katolikami francuskimi i wizyty u lekarza.
Cost for dinner and for magazine and for doctor visit.
Władze uznały, że koszt kolacji z przedstawicielami katolików się należy, ale wizyta u lekarza to wydatek nieuzasadniony.
The authorities admitted that the dinner and magazine costs can be refunded. However, a visit at the doctors cannot be refunded.
Tym samym starał się zawiązać tą antykomunistyczną krucjatę.
So he was trying to establish this anti-communistic crusade,
do której należeli
to which we belong.
Ambasador rządu londyńskiego, tu jest Kazimierz Papy.
Ambassador Kazimierz Papy of London government.
Włoski działacz akcji katolickiej Luigi Gedda.
Italian activist of anti-communist organization Luigi.
Akcji katolickiej Luigi Gedda.
Catholic organization, yes.
Również Federico Alessandrini z Osservatore Romano.
As well Federico Alessandrini from Osservatore Romano.
Ale głównie ojciec Józef Bocheński z Fryburga.
But mainly Father Józef Bocheński from Freiburg in Switzerland.
Początki ich wspólnej działalności antykomunistycznej sięgają 1950 roku, kiedy to w Szwajcarii pod patronatem biskupa Gawliny miał miejsce pierwszy zjazd katolicki Polonii.
The beginnings of their joint anti-communist activity is dated back to 1950, when in Switzerland, under the patronage of Bishop Gawlina, the first Catholic Congress of Polish diaspora was taking place.
I wtedy profesor Bocheński w obecności nuncjusza i biskupów szwajcarskich
and then Father Bocheński in the presence of Apostolic Nuncio Bishop Filippo Bernardini
wygłosił po francusku
had a lecture in French
wezwanie do zerwania z neutralnością w sprawach komunizmu,
the call to break up with the neutrality
i utworzenie swoistego frontu antykomunistycznego.
And to create a kind of anti-communist front.
I zacieśnienie wzajemnych kontaktów nastąpiło w czasie akademii zorganizowanej w Rzymie 25 stycznia 1951 roku na Uniwersytecie Gregoriańskim.
The mutual contacts were strengthened during the academy organized in Rome on January 25th in 1951 at the Georgian University.
Bo dla Gawliny było ważne, żeby ci przedstawiciele kościołów za żelaznej kurtyny, którzy są w Rzymie, właśnie utworzyli ten front antykomunistyczny.
For Gawlina was very important that the representative from the churches from behind the Iron Curtain could establish anti-communist organization.
I w czasie tej akademii Gawlina wystąpił z odczytem na temat zagrożeń i braków w duszpasterstwie emigracyjnym, domagając się w krajach zachodnich poszanowania tradycji lokalnych.
And during this academy, Gawlina had a speech talking about respecting the religious traditions and customs of the country of origin.
Celem grupy było zaprezentowanie jedności wszystkich katolików za żelaznej kurtyny.
The main goal of this group was to present the unity of all Catholics from behind the Iron Curtain.
Brali w nim udział przedstawiciele Litwy, Ukrainy, Łotwy, Węgier i innych krajów.
During this meeting, the representative from Lithuania, Hungary, another country were participating.
I impulsem do zawiązania grupy było przygotowanie do Międzynarodowego Kongresu Apostolstwa Świeckich, zorganizowanego w Rzymie w październiku 1951 roku.
And the impulse to form this group was the preparation for International Congress of the Lay Apostolate organized in Rome on October the 7th to the 14th of October in 1951.
I w czerwcu 1951 roku, Gawlinie widzieliśmy zdjęcie poprzednie, udało się zebrać pierwszy trzon tego antykomunistycznego ruchu.
And in June 1951, Gawlina managed to gather the core of this group.
Gawlina nazwał ten ruch Unitas, ale w dokumentach też watykańskich mowa o Chiesa del Silenzio czy Oltre Cortina.
Gawlina named this group Unitas, however, there were also mentioned other names.
13 października w czasie kongresu katolików głos zabrał ojciec Bocheński.
During the congress, może ksiądz powtórzyć datę?
Kongresu katolików świeckich.
During the Congress of Lay Catholics, there was a lecture of Father Bocheński.
Wygłosił on referat.
He had a lecture,
który był manifestem grupy Unitas.
That was the manifesto of Unitas group.
Zerwał do obojętności w krajach zachodnich wobec komunizmu.
He was calling to break up with the neutrality of Christians in the countries from the Iron Curtain.
Co zatem zaproponował ojciec Bocheński?
What actually Father Bocheński suggested?
Stworzenie Centrum Wymiany Myśli, jak również Instytutu Naukowego zajmującego się analizą sytuacji religijnych w państwach prześladowanych.
He suggested to create a center of exchange of ideas and research institute that would be dealing with the analysis of religious situation in persecuted countries.
Stosowanie form nacisku na zachodnią opinię publiczną skażoną prądami katolicyzmu postępowego mówił: nie kupujcie waszego pokoju za cenę ich krwi i za cenę dusz ich dzieci.
Also different forms of pressure on Western public opinion, polluted by the progressive Catholicism. He was saying, do not buy your peace at the price of their blood and the price of their children's souls.
Wyrazy solidarności, wyrazy jedności, pomoc materialna.
Also directing the words of solidarity, of unity and financial help.
W archiwum arcybiskupa Gawliny zachowały się notatki z zebrań, one były raz czy dwa razy do roku organizowane, notatki z zebrań grupy Unitas.
In the archive of Father, there were found notes from the meetings of the group Unitas.
Jak wyglądały obrady Unitasu?
What was the actually Unitas sessions like?
Przedstawiciele grupy zbierali i opracowali materiały.
The representatives of group collected and developed materials.
Dyskutowali na temat zagrożeń dla katolików ze strony komunizmu.
They were discussing about the threats to Catholics from the communists.
Tu widzimy na przykład że Podolski przekazuje część dokumentów na temat sytuacji w kościele za żelazną kurtyną.
We can see the picture which is delivered, and the document is about the problems of persecution of people behind the Iron Curtain.
Zebrane przez Gawlinę materiały trafiały do Watykańskiego Sekretariatu Stanu.
Gathered materials by Gawlina were sent to Secretary of State in Vatican.
Jak wykazano w walce antykomunistycznej, arcybiskup Józef Gawlina nie był więc sam.
As we can see, Archbishop Józef Gawlina was not alone in this battle against communism.
Jego celem było stworzenie ośrodka, który by to wszystko koordynował i analizował.
His aim was to create a center from which he could organize and coordinate all the actions.
I tak powstał we Fryburgu w 1953 roku arcybiskupi ośrodek dla spraw Kościoła w Polsce.
And this is how in September 25th in 1953 was established the Archbishop Center of Church Affairs in Poland.
Zbierano w nim materiały z wysonakładowej oficjalnej prasy wydawniczej wydawanej w Polsce.
In this organization, they were collecting, publishing great numbers magazines from Polish press.
Prowadzono bibliotekę.
There was a special library.
Ale jak widzimy, ośrodek zbierał informacje nie tylko na temat Polski, ale wszystkich krajów za żelazną kurtyną.
But as we can see, the center was collecting not only information about Poland, but also from all the countries from behind the Iron Curtain.
Jakie były owoce ośrodka?
What was the results of actions of the center?
Największym sukcesem arcybiskupa Gawliny, więc widzimy jedną z publikacji ośrodka.
The greatest success of Archbishop Gawlina was actually, we can see one of the publication.
Ale największym sukcesem arcybiskupa Gawliny w walce z komunistami było uzyskanie od Watykanu potępienia katolików współpracujących z władzą w Polsce, szczególnie Piaseckiego.
So actually the greatest success of Archbishop Gawlina's fight was getting the condemnation of leader of Polish progressive Catholics.
Tu mamy list Bocheńskiego ze stycznia 1955 roku do Gawliny. Trzeba potępić Piaseckiego.
We can see a letter from Father Bocheński to Archbishop Gawlina, where he was stating we should condemn progressive Catholics in Poland.
3 dni później Gawlina z listem był w sekretariacie stanu.
2 days later, Gawlina was with this letter in the Secretariat of State.
I uzyskał błogosławieństwo tego urzędu.
And he received blessing for these actions.
Koniec czerwca 1955 roku Watykan potępia Piaseckiego.
At the end of June 1955, the Vatican condemned the leader of PAX, Bolesław Piasecki.
Kolejnym dziełem Gawliny i Bocheńskiego było stworzenie summy przeciwko komunizmowi.
Another great work of Gawlina and Bocheński was creating a project which was called Summa Anti-Communist Summa.
Gawlina oczywiście podzielił się pomysłem w sekretariacie stanu.
Gawlina, of course, showed his idea in the Secretariat of State.
I w czerwcu 1955 roku pisał do Bocheńskiego.
And in June 1955 he was writing to Bocheński.
Wydanie książki jest częścią szerszej akcji Oltre Cortina. Z polecenia Watykanu przypadło mi zadanie przewodniczenia.
Publishing the book is a part of wider action of Alter Cortina, and on the order of Vatican I was giving the task of leading it.
Miało być to opracowanie zwięzłe, kompleksowe, dostarczające różnorodnych, niepodważalnych argumentów.
It was supposed to be a brief and comprehensive study, giving convincing arguments.
Ale naukowe.
But in written in a scientific way.
W grupie Unitasu Oltre Cortina nie zawsze to rozwiązanie znajdowało poparcie.
In the group of Unitas, this solution was not always welcome.
Na przykład Monsenier Buczko domagał się czegoś bardziej konkretnego. Jeżeli komuniści zażądają tego lub tego, wtedy należy tak i tak odpowiedzieć.
For example, Monsignor Ivan Buczko was demanding something more informative nature. For example, if the communists demand this or that, then it should be possible to answer this or that.
Książka ukazała się w 140 000 egzemplarzy w 1958 roku.
The book was published in 1958 in number of 114,000.
Pod nazwą Handbuch des Weltkommunismus.
The name was Handbuch der Kommunismus.
I to była wersja naukowa, natomiast powstała jeszcze druga wersja publicystyczna pod nazwą La Chiesa del Silenzio, Guarda a Roma.
And this was the scientific version. There was also another version issued a few years later, and the name was... Może ksiądz powtórzy nazwę?
La Chiesa del Silenzio Guarda a Roma.
La Chiesa del Silenzio Guarda a Roma.
Trzecim ważnym dziełem była książka Dieu contre Dieu przeciwko współpracy z katolikami progresywnymi, postępowymi.
The third very important publication was a book Dieu que Dieu, which was published to show work against communists.
Antykomunistyczna działalność arcybiskupa Gawliny za czasów Piusa XII z uwagą przypatrywały się władze w Polsce.
The anti-communist activity of Archbishop Gawlina under Pius XII was watched with attention by the authorities in Poland.
Niestety niewiele zachowało się materiałów archiwalnych na ten temat.
Unfortunately, we have very little archival materials on this subject.
Działalność antykomunistyczna arcybiskupa Gawliny nie znalazła poparcia również w oczach prymasa Polski Wyszyńskiego.
The anti-communist activity of Archbishop Gawlina was not that much supported by Cardinal Wyszyński, Prime of Poland.
Obu duchownych różniło podejście do komunizmu.
There was a huge difference in attitude to the communists of both.
Prymas Polski odrzucał bezkompromisową postawę Gawliny.
The Prime of Poland was rejecting the uncompromising attitude of Gawlina.
Uważając, że wobec znacznego osłabienia struktur kościelnych po zakończeniu II wojny światowej należało celem przetrwania rozpocząć z komunistami grę.
he was saying that in the view, under the risk of significant weakening of the church structures after the World War II, it was necessary to play a game with the communists in order to survive.
Prymas obawiał się również niezależności Gawliny.
The Primate of Poland was also afraid of Gawlina's independence.
Po śmierci Piusa XII,
after the death of Pius XII,
pomimo zmiany nastawienia Rzymu na sprawy komunizmu oraz stosunek do niego prymasa Wyszyńskiego,
despite the change of Rome's attitude towards communism and Primate Wyszyński's attitude towards Archbishop Gawlina,
Gawlina nie zaprzestał swej działalności.
Gawlina didn't stop his activities.
W dalszym ciągu odbywały się zebrania Unitasu.
Unitas meetings were continuing.
Pisze o tym profesor Hrabowiec w pracy poświęconej Chnilicy.
Ms. Hrabovec is writing about this in her book.
A Gawlina jako sekretarz komisji przed Soborem Watykańskim II.
And Gawlina as a secretary of commission just before the Second Vatican Council.
Przygotował propozycję schematu.
He prepared a proposal of scheme.
De cura animarum pro Christianis communismo infectis.
The name stays the same.
Dziękuję Państwu za uwagę.
Thank you for your attention.
I would also like to thank Mr. Klakus for not only for very interesting lecture, but also for the perfect time discipline, which allowed us to have a profound discussion, concluding discussion, so you could ask our panelists and also the participants of the seminar who are staying here. So when you would like to ask the question, please wait until my colleague will come with the microphone. It is necessary for the recording of this event to speak to the microphone. And as we already said, the language is the English. So please, if you are interested in asking any questions to our panelists, you have the opportunity. Professor Fejérdy.
Thank you. Just some simple and practical questions to Father Klakus about the archives you have used. As I saw, these were more or less private or semi-private archives of Gawlina and perhaps of Father Bohinski, no? En français. Donc, je voulais demander simplement quelle archive vous avez eu accès pour ce référent, parce que, comme j'ai vu, c'était plutôt des archives privées ou semi-privées du Gawlina et du Bohinski, si j'ai bien compris. Si ça existe, où ils sont conservés, en Fribourg, à Rome, ou juste pour curiosité.
Archiwa są w Polsce i po ukazaniu się artykułów z materiałem krytycznym to będą wykazane.
The archives are in Poland enough to show publishing the article.
You need the microphone.
Sorry. So the archives and the pictures are located in Poland, and after publishing of the article,
Będą wykazane w aparacie krytycznym.
There will be published.
Les archives sont en Pologne et la professeure a dit que cet article sera publié, donc après vous verrez où se trouvent des archives.
Any other question if you would like to ask?
I would like also a short and concrete question about radio broadcasting. You have mentioned that there were problems with getting separate Slovak broadcast on Free Europe. But what was about Vatican radio issue? Could you explore a bit about that?
Yes, of course. Maybe I made a mistake that I did not mention the Slovak, let's say, Catholic exile in Rome. Maybe it would be a better topic, but in the nascent Cold War, a special role in the whole context of the Slovak political exile played United States. I think you can understand it. It was most important to have their contacts and to have their activities and so on. So as for the Vatican radio, the Slovak broadcast was separate from 1949. From the beginning of Vatican broadcasting, there was a Czechoslovak board, but it was separated very quickly. I think that the attempts were even in the period of Second World War, when Karol Sidor, as envoy of Slovak state in the Holy See, had an opportunity to speak via Vatican radio in 1943. It was for the first time, as I remember. And then after the Second World War, there was very quickly arranged there was very clearly arranged a Slovak broadcasting, as it was, for example, in other Western countries. So I would say it, in contradiction, in other words, Radio Free Europe and Voice of America were the only Western broadcasts where there was not a Slovak broadcasting. I believe you can understand. So BBC had Slovak broadcasts. The Spanish national radio had only Slovak broadcasts, and Czech, of course, Czech and Slovak, so separate, two separate. Even the Deutsche Welle in Germany had its own Slovak broadcast from the 60s, from the 1960s, and so on. So Radio Free Europe and Voice of America were real exceptions, where only Czechoslovak desk existed, and the attempts to establish a separate Slovak desk were very strong from the beginning. But we can see here an influence of the American politics on these anti-communist radios, which accepted only the status quo in Central Europe, so Czechoslovak state, and no division of it, and that's why Czechoslovak desk. So maybe I have answered the question.
Thank you.
I have a question to Professor Fejérdy. Sorry, yeah, I may. You mentioned in your presentation that by the later months of 1946, the relationship between the Jesuit priests and Cardinal Mindszenty had deteriorated beyond repair. And could you please tell us if you have researched what were the causes of this decay? Thank you.
Yes, of course, thank you. It was a strategical question, which was the dispute between them. The Jesuit fathers opted for accommodation and modus vivendi within the Hungarian context to find a way of compromise with the evolving communist regime, and Mindszenty was against it. His stance was more or less intransigent. Just like Professor Hrabovec has mentioned, Mindszenty's name became also, how to say, a cover name or a special expression to present a way of confrontation with communists, a confrontation not only on a political terrain, but also in a spiritual one. So he, from the beginning, even if in some special cases was open to some discussion with the government, he refused any compromise. And the case behind this dispute is a very special case. The Jesuits founded a youth agricultural organization in the 30s, And they wanted to maintain this organization even after Second World War. And as first time in the Treaty of Armistice, all fascist organizations were dissolved. They could maintain their organization, and they wanted to continue so when 2 years later also the rest of the Catholic and other bourgeois organizations were dissolved. They wanted to maintain their own organization, to have larger social support for Christian politics as well. They thought it was possible to find a modus vivendi with the regime and to save some Christian structures. And Mindszenty was against it, and that's why their relationship deteriorated. And the last step, or the last ultima goccia, the last step in this conflict was that the Jesuits wanted to have Vatican support for their views against the cardinal, and it was unacceptable for the cardinal.
Okay.
I would like to ask Father Klakus, Kazimierz von Pape. I believe Kazimierz von Pape is a name for you. He was ambassador of Polish exile government in Rome. He knew personally very good Karol Sidor, and I believe that there were a kind of friendship between him and Bishop Gawlina. Maybe you could say something about this. Kazimierz von Pape stayed in Rome after 1945 until his death, as I know, in the 70s. And he also wrote, as Bishop Gawlina, you gave me a present about his diaries. Von Pape has written also his own diaries. I think that they were not published until today. So do you have any information about possible cooperation between Bishop Gawlina, Kazimierz von Pape, or let's say how looked the situation in the Polish exile in Rome like?
Jeżeli chodzi o kolaborację między Pape i Gawliną,
when it comes to the cooperation between Pape and Gawlina,
to Pape traktował Gawlinę instrumentalnie.
Pape was treating Gawlina in an instrumental way.
Pape doskonale zdawał sobie sprawę, że jego racja bytu w Watykanie jest możliwa dzięki antykomunistycznej postawie Gawliny.
Pape was aware that he can be in Rome thanks to Gawlina anti-communistic status.
Gdyż na obecność Papy, który był doyen korpusu dyplomatycznego w Watykanie, w pewnym momencie on się tak przedstawia w listach, bo zachowały się listy. Że należał do korpusu dyplomatycznego.
He was part of the diplomatic corps.
Niechętnie patrzyły, szczególnie po 1957 roku.
Very unwilling was seeing, especially after 57.
Zarówno sekretariat stanu,
Secretary of State,
co zarzucano Gawlinie, że odbywa rozmowy z Papę.
Actually, Gawlina was accused of having conversations with Pape.
Jak i prymas Wyszyński, który nie chciał, będąc w Rzymie, spotykać się z Papą.
As well as Wyszynski, who, while being in Rome, didn't want to meet Pape.
Zachowały się listy, są wydrukowane listy Papego do Londynu.
We have letters from Pape sent to London. Sorry.
Oczywiście Gawlina też nie był bezinteresowny.
Gawlina was also having his interest in this relationship.
Bo dzięki ambasadzie Papego,
because thanks to embassy of Pape,
otrzymywał część informacji z Londynu na temat sytuacji w krajach za żelazną kurtyną.
He was receiving information from the embassy about the situation in countries from behind the Iron Curtain.
Thank you. Also some other questions to the concluding discussion. We have some place. Okay, so if there are not any more questions, I would like to make a conclusion of this research workshop and would like to thank, first and foremost, I would like to thank Professor Emília Hrabovec and the Roman Catholic Theological Faculty of St. Cyril and Methodius of the Comenius University in Bratislava, who was the main organizer of this workshop. And thanks to her, we were able to meet here in the very representative people and speakers and researchers around Europe. And I would like to ask you to say some organizational matters regarding the publication.
Thank you very much. I would like, on my behalf and on behalf of my faculty and the Nations Memory Institute, if it is allowed to speak also on behalf of the Nations Memory Institute, to thank you everybody for coming for a very active discussion. And I'm looking forward to the publication. So this would be the last annunciation from my part. We are having the intention to publish all the papers in English language in order to enable an international discussion. So all the papers will be published and all the authors will be receiving a letter from our part with all indications about the delivery term and about the citation rules. So thank you very much and have a nice afternoon and have a nice day in Bratislava. Thank you.
I will also say some words and some thanks. I would also like to thank all the panelists. We really appreciate that you find the way, come here to Bratislava, already enjoyed it and will enjoy it until your stay. And we can see that the weather is like in the Rome, probably, so it is very closely connected with the topic we are dealing with. But we really appreciate that we are able to meet in person, which is, as we saw during the last 2 years, really a unique opportunity. I would also like to thank my colleagues from the Nations Memory Institute, from the Department of Research and Education for the help with the organization of this event, my colleagues from the Department of Documentation who come here and spend the time with us, and also my colleagues from the Department of the Audiovisual Work, because thanks to the work they did, we will be able to see very soon the video from this workshop on the YouTube channel of the Nations Memory Institute. We will give you the information when the video will be available. And I would also like to thank all the guests that you spend your time with us. I am sure that it was a very interesting topics and the presentations. And finally, I would also like to invite you to the other event of the Nations Memory Institute. The first one will be the next Thursday in the Polish Center, when we will have the discussion and the short movie presentation on the liberation of the concentration camps. And later on in the June, it will be followed by also the other events organized by our institution. So once again, thank you very much, and hopefully we will see very soon. Have a nice day.